Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Quick question for my fellow crime junkies. Where are you watching this from right now? Midnight scrolling in bed? Headphones in at the gym? Sneaking an episode during lunch break? Tell me where in the world you are and what device you're on. I love seeing how this community shows up. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more chilling stories. Now, before we begin tonight, I want you to do something for me. If you are in bed, I want you to pull that blanket just a little bit higher. If you have headphones in, lower the volume just enough so that my voice becomes something soft, something that moves through the room like a breeze rather than a storm. Dim your screen if you can. Take one slow breath in and let it out even slower. There is no rush tonight. We are going to take our time. We are going to walk gently through one of the most haunting and unresolved mysteries in the history of San Francisco, a city of fog and secrets and streets that have swallowed the truth whole. But before any of that, I need to say something important. The story you are about to hear involves a real person, a real girl, a real life that was taken far too soon. Her name was Nora Fuller, and for many decades, she has rested in near obscurity, her case unsolved, her killer never brought to justice. Tonight, we are not here to be entertained by her tragedy. We are here to remember her, to say her name, to sit with the weight of what happened to her, and to honor the truth that real people existed inside every crime story this channel has ever told. Her life mattered. Her story matters. And we tell it tonight with the deepest respect. Now, let us begin. San Francisco in the winter of 1902 was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, it was a place of extraordinary ambition, a city that had grown wild and fast from the fever of the gold rush half a century before, a city of hills and cable cars and bay fog that rolled in from the Pacific like a slow gray curtain being drawn across a stage. The streets were alive with commerce, with noise, with the particular energy of a place that believed in itself completely. There were theaters and hotels and gaslit restaurants where men in silk hats dined on porterhouse steaks and discussed the newspapers with the casual confidence of people who believed the world was moving in a direction they understood. On the other hand, beneath all of that glitter, beneath the fog and the gaslight and the restaurant clatter, there was something else. Something older and darker. Poverty ran through the city's lower neighborhoods like a cold, underground stream. Children worked. Families fractured. Women and girls navigated a world that offered them very little protection and expected them to manage whatever dangers that world chose to send their way. There were no safety nets worth speaking of, no shelters, no agencies designed to catch the people who fell. You either found your footing or you disappeared, and the city, magnificent and merciless as it was, rarely paused to ask what had happened to you. It was into this world that a 15-year-old girl named Nora Fuller stepped on the morning of January 11th, 1902, with a postal card in her hand and hope in her chest, and was never seen alive again. Her real name, the name she had been born with, was Eleanor Parline. She had come into the world in 1886, not in San Francisco, not even in America, but in China, where her father had been working. The details of her earliest years are soft and incomplete, the way the details of poor children's lives so often are. No one thought to record them carefully. No one imagined that this particular girl's story would one day be told across the decades. What we know is that her father was a man who worked aboard ships, a man connected to the sea in the way that men of that era often were, when oceans were highways and ships were how the world moved itself from one place to another. And then, at some point during Nora's young childhood, her father boarded a steamer called the Taiwa, and he did not come back. The ship encountered some kind of disaster. The exact details have blurred with time, and her father simply vanished. Gone from the earth as completely as if he had never existed. No body recovered. No proper goodbye. Just an absence that arrived one day and never left. Nora would have been very young when this happened. Young enough that perhaps she did not fully understand what the loss meant, but old enough to feel the shape of the hole it carved into her family's life. Her mother eventually remarried, the way women had to in those days, because the alternative was poverty so complete it swallowed everything. But the second marriage did not hold either, and when it ended in divorce, Nora's mother was left again to navigate a world that did not make survival particularly easy for a woman on her own with children to care for. They settled on Fulton Street, at number 1747, a modest address in a modest part of the city. The kind of address where you kept the heat low in winter, and you made every meal stretch as far as it would go, and you did not talk too loudly about the things you needed, because there was no one listening who could give them to you. Nora quit school at 15. This was not unusual. This was simply what happened in families like hers. The books had to close and the hands had to start working, because survival required it. She was a pretty girl, by the accounts that survive. Photographs from the era show a young woman with dark eyes and a certain quiet gravity about her, the kind of face that suggests someone who has already learned to think carefully before she speaks. There were rumors, gently kept, that she had theatrical aspirations, that she admired the stage, that she imagined, in the private theater of her own mind, something larger than Fulton Street, and careful meals, and the slow grind of making ends meet. Whether those dreams were real or invented later by newspapers hungry for a sympathetic story is impossible to know now. What we know is that she was 15 years old. She had recently quit school. She was looking for work, and on the morning of January 11th, 1902, she received a postal card in the mail that seemed to offer her exactly what she was looking for. The card had been sent in response to a newspaper advertisement. The advertisement, and this detail matters, so hold it in your mind. Read something like this. A young white girl wanted to take care of a baby. The address for responses had been given as a post office box, and whoever had placed the advertisement had been using the name John Bennett. The postal card Nora received instructed her to come to the popular restaurant on 55 Geary Street, where she was to meet this man, this John Bennett, who would presumably discuss the position with her and perhaps offer her the work she needed. She told her mother she was going. She dressed herself and she left the house on Fulton Street with the card in her hand. And somewhere between that front door and whatever came next, Nora Fuller walked out of her life and into a story that would grip San Francisco for months. She never came home. Her mother waited. The hours passed, the way they always do when you are waiting for someone who should have returned, slowly at first, then with a gathering weight, the kind of heaviness that settles in your chest when the clock hands move past the point where there should have been a knock at the door and there is only silence. Nora's mother knew her daughter had gone to meet someone about a job. She knew the name Bennett. She knew the restaurant on Geary Street. But the hours became the evening and the evening became the night, and no one came home. And eventually the silence in that house on Fulton Street became the kind that changes everything. In the days that followed, the family tried to find her. They reached out. They asked questions. The city was large, and a 15-year-old girl without money and without connections could be swallowed by it entirely. And San Francisco in 1902 did not have the kind of investigative machinery that might locate a missing girl quickly. But there were witnesses. There were people who had seen things. And what they had seen, piece by piece, would eventually begin to assemble itself into a picture so carefully constructed, so deliberately designed, that it would make the blood run cold. Because here is the thing that would only emerge later, when investigators started asking the right questions in the right places. 3 days before Nora Fuller disappeared, 3 full days before January 11th, 1902, someone had already rented an apartment. And that apartment had been rented for one purpose only. What that purpose was, and what was found inside that apartment nearly a month later, is the heart of this story. But we are not there yet. There is more you need to know first. More about the man with the silk hat and the brown mustache who ate only the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks. More about the aliases and the false addresses and the mattress that was delivered only at night. More about a girl who may have known her killer better than anyone was willing to admit. We have a long night ahead of us, and there is no need to rush. Let the story come to you slowly, the way the fog comes to San Francisco, gently, completely, until everything you thought you could see clearly has softened into something harder to read. Settle in a little deeper. Take another slow breath. We are just getting started. The popular restaurant on Geary Street was the kind of establishment that occupied a comfortable middle ground in the social landscape of early 20th century San Francisco. It was not the grandest dining room in the city, not the sort of place where politicians made deals over champagne, but it was respectable. Clean tablecloths, decent food. The kind of place where a man could sit without drawing too much attention, could conduct business over a meal, could come and go without the weight of too many curious eyes following him out the door. The owner, a man named F.W. Crone, would later describe what he had seen on the day Nora Fuller walked through his door. A man had been coming to his restaurant with some regularity in the days and weeks leading up to January 11th. Not every day, but often enough to be noticed. Often enough for the staff to give him a nickname. The man was well dressed, which is to say that he looked like someone who understood the importance of appearances. He wore a silk hat, the kind of tall, polished hat that said, without words, that the person wearing it was a man of standing, a man who moved through the world in a particular way. He had a brown mustache, neat and deliberate. His manner was calm, composed. He was the kind of man who sat down, looked at the menu with an unhurried eye, and ordered the same thing every time he came. The tenderloin of the porterhouse steak. Only that. Never anything else. The staff had taken to calling him tenderloin. This is the kind of small, human detail that stays with you. The way even the most careful and calculating person can be summarized, eventually, by a habit. By the small, ordinary things they do without thinking, because they never imagined that those ordinary things would one day become evidence. On January 11th, Tenderloin was there. And on that same afternoon, a 15-year-old girl with a postal card in her hand walked into the popular restaurant and sat down across from him. What happened inside that restaurant? What was said? What was promised? What kind of performance this man put on for a 15-year-old girl who wanted nothing more than to earn a living is something we can only partially reconstruct. We know she was there. We know he was there. We know that F.W. Crone and at least one member of his staff saw them together. We know that the meeting appeared, on its surface, to be exactly what Nora had been told it would be. A conversation about a job, about a baby to be cared for, about domestic work that would pay her something and give her a foothold in a world that required money to survive. We also know that at some point during that afternoon, Nora Fuller apparently became worried. Something shifted. Maybe it was something he said. Maybe it was the address he gave her, 1500 Geary Street, where she was supposedly to report for work. Maybe something in her chest tightened in the way it does when the story you're being told begins to feel slightly wrong, slightly off, like a note played almost correctly, but not quite. Whatever it was, Nora made a phone call. She called home. The details of exactly when this happened and precisely what she said have softened and blurred across the decades. The way ink softens and blurs when it gets wet. But the core of the call was this. She was on her way somewhere. She seemed uncertain. She may have been reassuring her family, or she may have been trying to reassure herself. And then she hung up the phone and she walked out into the January air of San Francisco, and she went wherever it was this man had directed her to go. The address she had been given, 1500 Geary Street, turned out to be a vacant lot. There was no house there. There was no family there. There was no baby. There was nothing at all. Just an empty space where a building should have been, sitting in the winter air of a city that was going about its day, without any knowledge that a girl had just walked into the invisible architecture of a trap. But Nora did not return home from that vacant lot. She went somewhere. She went with someone, or towards someone, or in the direction of something she believed was still waiting for her. And she was never seen alive again. For weeks after January 11th, San Francisco did not yet know what had happened. The Fuller family knew their daughter was missing. They knew something had gone wrong. But the city was large, and missing persons in 1902 did not generate the immediate, coordinated response that we might expect today. There were inquiries made. There were questions asked. The newspapers eventually caught the story, because newspapers in that era functioned as both information sources and entertainment, and the disappearance of a pretty 15-year-old girl from a respectable family, even a poor one, had exactly the kind of pathos and mystery that sold papers on street corners. But for weeks, there was nothing solid. No body. No confirmed evidence of crime. Only absence. Absence, and the slow, patient work of investigators who began to ask themselves a fundamental question. Who was John Bennett? The name, of course, was false. This became clear almost immediately. There was no John Bennett at any of the addresses he had offered. There was no record of such a man at the hotels he had mentioned. The name was a costume, worn for a specific purpose and then discarded, and the man behind it had taken considerable care to make sure the costume was all anyone could find. But people remember things. People see things. And even the most careful predator, moving through the world with deliberate calm, leaves traces. He had eaten at the popular restaurant. He had worn a silk hat and a brown mustache. He had ordered the tenderloin of the porterhouse steak. These were not the details of a ghost. These were the details of a man who had walked through the world in a physical body and left behind, in the minds of the people who had seen him, a partial portrait that investigators could begin to sketch. And then there was the apartment. On January 8, 1902, 3 days before Nora Fuller disappeared, 3 days before the postal card and the restaurant and the vacant lot at 1500 Geary Street, a man had walked into a building at 2211 Sutter Street and rented an apartment. He had given the landlady a name. The name was C.B. Hawkins. He said he was currently staying at the Golden West Hotel, that he needed a place of his own, that he would pay a full month's rent in advance and ask no questions and expect none in return. The landlady accepted the money. She did not verify the hotel address. She did not ask for references. In 1902, with a month's rent cash in hand, a landlady did not always feel the need to press too hard. He got the apartment. He got the key. And then he began to prepare it. What he did to that apartment in the days between January 8th and January 11th is the kind of methodical, cold-blooded preparation that distinguishes a moment of violence from something far more disturbing. A plan. A plan that had been conceived in advance, worked through carefully, adjusted for contingencies, and carried out with the patience of someone who was not acting on impulse but executing a design. He bought a mattress. Not a fine one. Nothing that suggested comfort or care, but functional. A thing for a body to lie on. He arranged for it to be delivered not during the day, when neighbors might notice and remember, but at night. He took a pen or some instrument and wrote his initials on the mattress in a way that could later be identified, CBH. He bought sheets, new ones, a blanket, a comforter, pillowcases, a chair, the bare minimum of what a room needs to look inhabited, to look like a place where a person might reasonably stay. But there was no food, no cooking supplies, no arrangements made for gas or light. The room was not being prepared for living. It was being prepared for something else entirely, something that required only the mattress, the bed linens, the chair, the darkness, and the solitude of an apartment that no one knew about, in a building where the man who had rented it had given a false name and a false hotel address, and whose connection to the real world was exactly as thin and as breakable as he intended it to be. He had built the room before he brought her to it. That is the part that must sit with you for a moment. He knew, 3 days in advance, that he would need a room like this. He knew, 3 days before Nora Fuller left her house on Fulton Street with a postal card in her hand, that she would be coming to him. Because he had already put the machinery in motion. He had already placed the advertisement. He had already written the postal card. He had already chosen the restaurant and the false address and the name John Bennett. And he had already rented the room. If that does not make the hair on the back of your neck stand up just slightly, I want you to think about it again. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of terrible impulse. This was architecture. This was someone sitting down, somewhere, at some point before January 8th, 1902, and thinking through the steps. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. Each piece in its place. Each piece accounted for. And at the center of all that careful planning, like a name written into a calendar on a specific date, was a 15-year-old girl who needed a job. He had chosen her because she was vulnerable, because she had answered an advertisement, because she had taken the first step toward him, and all he had to do was make sure the path between her and the room at 2211 Sutter Street looked, from where she was standing, like something reasonable, like something safe, like a job offer and a meeting at a restaurant and an address to report to for work. And on January 11th, 1902, it had worked exactly as he had planned. The weeks that followed Nora's disappearance were full of the particular kind of anguish that descends on a family when someone is missing and the waiting has no end and no answer. Her mother must have replayed the morning of January 11th 1,000 times. The way Nora had dressed, the postal card, the door closing behind her, the sound of her footsteps going down the front steps and away into the city. Every parent who has ever lost a child knows something of that replaying. The mind's desperate attempt to find the thing it missed, the moment where everything could have been different if only someone had said the right word or asked the right question or reached out and held on. But nothing in the replaying could bring her back. And so the family waited, and the investigators asked their questions, and the newspapers began to fill their front pages with what little they knew, and San Francisco began to pay attention. It would be nearly a month before the truth was found. A month in which the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street sat quiet and dark, its shade pulled down against the daylight, its door closed against the world, its secret held perfectly still in the winter air of a city that did not yet know to look there. A month. And then, on February 8th, 1902, an inspector arrived. He climbed the stairs. He stood at the door. He opened it. What he found inside that room is what the entire city of San Francisco had been dreading without quite knowing it. What he found is what every mother who reads a newspaper over breakfast and then looks up at her daughter across the table silently, desperately does not want to find. But we are not quite there yet. Because before we step inside that room, there is something you need to understand about the man who had prepared it. Something that will change the way you hear everything that comes next. And that something has to do with a question that the investigators had already begun to ask quietly, in the careful, circling way that investigators ask questions when they are not yet sure of the answer, but are beginning to feel the shape of it. Had Nora Fuller known this man before January 11th? Had she known him well? The answer, when it began to come, would complicate everything. February 8th, 1902 began like most winter mornings in San Francisco, gray and cold. The bay fog pressing down on the city's hills like a hand on a shoulder, the streets wet with the kind of damp that soaks through wool and settles into your bones before you have walked half a block. It was not an unusual morning. Men went to their offices, and women went to their markets, and children, the ones who still went to school, pulled their coats tighter and moved through the fog with the resigned endurance of people accustomed to wet weather. The inspector who was dispatched to 2211 Sutter Street that morning went because someone had finally made a connection that no one had made before, or at least, no one had acted on before. The apartment at 2211 Sutter Street, rented to a man named C.B. Hawkins, paying a month in advance, with a false hotel address and no references and a mattress delivered at night. That apartment had sat in the peripheral awareness of the investigation without yet becoming its center. But on February 8th, something shifted. Something finally directed official attention to that address. The inspector arrived. He found the building. He found the right door. He knocked, and there was no answer, because there was no one alive inside to answer. He opened the door and stepped into the narrow entry of the apartment, and the first thing he would have noticed, the very first thing, was the quality of the darkness. In daylight, with the window shade pulled all the way down, the apartment was not simply dim, it was sealed. It was the kind of darkness that feels intentional, the kind that has been arranged by someone who needed to keep the light out. He moved through the small space of the apartment. He found the bedroom. He pushed open the door. The shade in the bedroom window was pulled down. The room was very dark. And on the mattress that had been purchased and delivered at night and initialed with the letters CBH, there was a figure lying still. Lying in the particular stillness that belongs only to the dead. Lying in the position of someone who had been arranged, carefully arranged, as if placed there with a kind of terrible consideration. It was Nora Fuller. She had been there for nearly a month. She had been there since the night of January 11th, 1902, or perhaps the very early hours of January 12th. The coroner would later determine that death had occurred within 24 hours of her disappearance, which meant that whatever had been done to her had been done quickly, that very first night. And then the apartment had been locked and the shade had been pulled down and the city had gone about its business for 4 full weeks while she lay there in the dark. She was 15 years old. She had gone to a restaurant to discuss a job, and she had been murdered in a room that a man had spent 3 days preparing specifically for the purpose of receiving her. The inspector would have stood in that doorway for a moment. You cannot imagine it otherwise. Cannot imagine a human being of any training or experience stepping into that scene without a moment of stillness, a moment of the kind of horror that moves through the body like cold water before the professional mind asserts itself and begins to take inventory. Because the inspector's job, whatever he felt in that doorway, was to look, to observe, to record. The coroner came. The physicians came. And the examination of Nora Fuller and the room she had been left in began to yield, slowly and painstakingly, the physical evidence that might tell investigators something about the man who had done this. She had been strangled. The marks on her throat were described as 2 distinct black marks, the traces of hands that had applied pressure with enough force and enough duration to end a life. She had not been poisoned. The contents of her stomach, examined carefully by the coroner, revealed the remains of an apple, suggesting she had eaten sometime on January 11th, perhaps at the restaurant, perhaps on the way there, in that ordinary way of a girl going about her day who pauses to eat a piece of fruit because she is young and alive and hungry and has no idea that the day is going to end the way it is going to end. There were signs of alcohol in her system, slight congestion that suggested she had consumed some, though not a dramatic amount. There was a whiskey bottle in the room. There was a cigar butt. There was, perhaps most intriguingly, a scrap of newspaper, a fragment of the Denver Post, a newspaper published in Colorado, hundreds of miles from San Francisco, a newspaper that had no obvious reason to be in an apartment rented by a man calling himself C.B. Hawkins on Sutter Street. This scrap of newspaper, this small and ordinary piece of printed paper from the Denver Post, would become one of the most persistent threads in the investigation that followed. How had it gotten there? Who had brought it? A man who read the Denver Post regularly would presumably have some connection to Denver. He would be someone who traveled between the two cities, or had lived in one and moved to the other, or had contacts in both places. The scrap of Denver Post in a San Francisco murder room was a geographic clue hiding inside an otherwise carefully sanitized space. Because that was the other thing the examination of the room revealed. How little was there. Beyond the mattress and the bed linens and the chair and the whiskey bottle and the cigar, but in the fragment of newspaper, the room was almost entirely empty. No food, as had been noted at the time of the rental. No personal items belonging to the man who had rented it. Nothing that might identify him beyond the initials on the mattress and the rental agreement signed with a false name. He had prepared the room, and he had used it, and then he had walked away from it. And in his walking away, he had taken with him everything that might have connected him to the world outside. Almost everything. Because the Denver Post fragment was still there, and the cigar butt was still there, and the mattress was still there with its initials, and the rental agreement existed, signed in a particular handwriting that belonged to a particular hand. And the restaurant on Geary Street had a staff who remembered the man they called Tenderloin, who wore a silk hat and a brown mustache, and ate only the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks. These were threads. Thin threads, but threads nonetheless. And the investigators who now stood in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street and looked at what had been done to a 15-year-old girl from Fulton Street began the work of pulling those threads, one by one, to see what might unravel. San Francisco was about to find out. The newspapers, already trailing the story of Nora's disappearance for weeks, caught fire when the body was found. The discovery at 2211 Sutter Street moved from the back pages to the front pages with the speed that true horror always generates. The speed of a city recognizing that the thing it had been quietly fearing was real, was worse than it had imagined, and was apparently still out there. Because whoever had done this had walked away, had locked the door and pulled the shade and disappeared back into the city, or perhaps out of the city entirely, and no one knew where he had gone. And the circulars describing C.B. Hawkins and John Bennett and the man they called Tenderloin were being printed and distributed, but there was no guarantee they would find him. San Francisco in February of 1902 was a city that suddenly understood something that cities sometimes forget until a case like this forces the reminder that predators move among ordinary people. That the man with the silk hat at the restaurant, the man who ate the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks with such calm regularity that the staff gave him a nickname, was the same man who had prepared a room in the dark and rented it with a false name and let a 15-year-old girl into it. That ordinary appearances and extraordinary evil can exist in the same person simultaneously, without contradiction, without anything on the outside that announces what is happening within. The women of San Francisco, in particular, felt something shift in the weeks that followed. Because the story of Nora Fuller was the story of a girl who had done everything that a girl in her position might reasonably do. She had seen an advertisement. She had responded to it. She had gone to a public place, a restaurant, to meet someone about a job. She had called home to check in. These were not the actions of a reckless person. These were the actions of a careful person, a person trying to be responsible, a person navigating a world that offered her limited options and trying to find the best one. And it had not been enough to protect her, which meant that the protective measures available to a girl like Nora were not actually protective at all. That realization moved through San Francisco like the fog, quietly, completely, without anyone quite being able to say where it had entered. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, and very soon, it would take a turn that no one had expected. A turn that involved not just the man who had rented the apartment and ordered the steak, but the question of whether Nora Fuller had known her killer long before January 11th, 1902. Whether the advertisement and the postal card and the restaurant meeting were not the beginning of the story at all, but something closer to the end of a much longer one. A girl named Madge Graham knew things that she had not yet told anyone, and what she had to say would change everything. Madge Graham was a young woman who had known Nora Fuller in the way that girls in close-knit working-class neighborhoods know each other. Not always through formal friendship, but through the proximity of shared streets and shared circumstances, through the kind of casual intimacy that develops when two people are living similar lives in overlapping spaces. She knew Nora. She had spent time with her. And when Nora disappeared and the case exploded across the front pages of every newspaper in San Francisco, Madge Graham found herself holding information that she had kept quietly to herself for reasons that were, perhaps, entirely understandable. Because what Madge knew suggested something that the newspapers, in their coverage of the case, had not yet touched upon. What Madge knew suggested that the story of Nora Fuller and the man called John Bennett did not begin with a postal card arriving in January of 1902. It had begun before that, considerably before that, when investigators finally reached Madge Graham and sat down with her. In the careful, quiet way that good investigators approach a witness who seems to be carrying something heavy, she told them what she knew. And what she knew was this: Nora Fuller had known an older man. She had been meeting him in secret for some period of time before her disappearance. She had received telephone calls from this man, calls placed through the grocery store near the Fuller home, because of course in 1902 most ordinary households did not have their own telephones, and so the local grocery store or pharmacy might serve as a message center, a place where you could take calls and receive word, and then return to your own home knowing that someone had been trying to reach you. These calls had apparently come with some regularity, and Nora, according to Madge, had also been the recipient of something else from this older man: theater tickets. Complimentary ones. The kind of gift that costs the giver very little and means a great deal to a 15-year-old girl from a poor family who dreamed of the stage and had never had money enough to sit in a proper theater seat and watch a performance from somewhere other than the cheapest seats, if she could get in at all. Theater outings. Secret phone calls. An older man whose name, in the telling, was Bennett. Let that settle for just a moment. Because what Madge Graham was describing was not a random encounter between a stranger and a victim. What she was describing was a pattern. The kind of slow, deliberate, patient pattern that we now understand very well. Because we have names for it now. Clinical names and legal names and names used in the literature of child protection and criminal psychology. But that in 1902 did not have those names and was not widely understood as the particular kind of crime it is. The giving of gifts, the establishing of contact through indirect channels, the grocery store telephone rather than the front door, the cultivation of a relationship outside the awareness of family, the investment of time and attention in a young person who was financially vulnerable, emotionally hungry, and perhaps flattered by the sustained interest of someone older who seemed sophisticated and connected and capable of opening doors that poverty had kept firmly shut. This was grooming. In the language of our own time, this was a predator who had identified a target and spent weeks or perhaps months carefully building the architecture of trust before January 11th ever arrived. The postal card and the restaurant meeting and the fake job offer were not the beginning of what had happened to Nora Fuller. They were the culmination. They were the moment the machinery of a long, careful preparation finally came to its conclusion. And Nora, who had known this man as Bennett, who had received his phone calls and his theater tickets and presumably experienced from him whatever version of warmth and attention and interest he had chosen to perform. Nora may not have been walking into a meeting with a stranger on January 11th. She may have been walking into a meeting with someone she already trusted, someone she already thought of, in whatever terms seemed appropriate to her understanding of the situation, as a friend. Maybe even more than a friend. Which means that the cruelty of what was done to her was not only the violence itself. It was also the betrayal. The particular, calculated betrayal of someone who had spent time making a vulnerable girl believe she mattered to him, making her feel seen and chosen and special, for the sole purpose of making it easier to lead her, when the time came, to a room he had already prepared. The investigation was now expanding. What had initially appeared to be a case of a girl lured by a fraudulent job advertisement was becoming something more complex, more layered, more disturbing in its implications. Because if Bennett had been cultivating a relationship with Nora for weeks or months in advance, then the advertisement in the newspaper was not his method, it was merely his cover. The real method was the relationship, the trust, the careful accumulation of access to a girl who had no reason to suspect that the interest being shown in her was anything other than genuine. The grocery store owner near the Fuller home confirmed what Madge Graham had said about the telephone calls. There had been calls, regular ones, someone calling for Nora, and Nora going to the store to take those calls. The owner could not identify the caller. This was a telephone, in 1902, without any means of tracing or recording, but the calls had happened. They were real. They were part of a pattern. And then there was another name that came up in the investigation, a name that arrived with a peculiar timing that made investigators look up from their notes and pay close attention. The name was M.A. Severbrinick. It appeared on a card found in Nora's purse, or rather, associated with Nora's belongings in some way that connected it to the investigation. And the timing was striking. M.A. Severbrinick had, by the accounts available to investigators, sailed to China in the hours immediately following Nora Fuller's disappearance. Hours. Someone associated with Nora's life, whose card was connected to her belongings, had left the country on the very day she vanished. Was Severbrinick connected to the man who had killed her? Was Severbrinick the killer himself, having arranged the murder and then departed before it could be attributed to him? Was Severbrinick an innocent acquaintance whose departure was coincidental, or perhaps someone who knew more than he had said and had chosen the ocean as his means of escape from the questions a more thorough investigation might have asked? The investigation tried to follow this thread and found it frustratingly elusive. A man on a ship to China was, in 1902, effectively out of reach, and whatever Severbrinick knew or did not know about Nora Fuller would remain on the far side of the Pacific unless someone went to extraordinary lengths to find it. It was a red herring, or it was something darker. The investigation could not be certain. And so, like so many threads in this case, it dangled, real enough to notice, too slippery to hold. What the investigators could hold, what they could examine and measure and analyze, was the handwriting. And among the physical evidence gathered from the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street, and from the investigation of the advertisement and the rental, there were two specimens of handwriting that appeared to have been produced by the same hand. The first was the rental agreement signed by C.B. Hawkins at 2211 Sutter Street. The second was the written portion of the advertisement, the actual notation on the advertisement slip, the handwriting of whoever had placed the ad in the newspaper that Nora Fuller had responded to. Someone, an expert, a man named Theodore Kitka who worked in the analysis of handwriting and documents, was brought in to examine these two specimens and render a professional opinion. He compared them carefully. He looked at the letter formations, the pressure patterns, the particular idiosyncrasies that are as individual to a person's handwriting as a fingerprint is to their finger. He examined 32,000 address change cards as part of the comparison process, a staggering number, a testament to how seriously the investigators were taking this line of inquiry. He was working to eliminate other possibilities, to narrow the field, to establish with the clearest possible certainty whether the man who had rented the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street was also the man who had placed the advertisement. His conclusion, when it came, sent a shockwave through the investigation. The handwriting matched. The man who had rented the apartment as C.B. Hawkins was the same man who had placed the newspaper advertisement as John Bennett. They were aliases, two names worn by the same person, two doors into the same terrible room. The predator who had groomed Nora Fuller and cultivated her trust and prepared a space for her in the dark. He had used different names in different corners of his plan, but his hand had remained the same. His handwriting had remained the same. And now, for the first time, the investigators had something that felt like a thread they could actually follow. Because if you have a man's handwriting, and you have his aliases, and you have witness descriptions of his appearance, the silk hat, the brown mustache, the particular habit of ordering only the tenderloin, then you have the beginning of an identification. You have the beginning of a person, not yet a name, not yet a face, but the beginning of something that might lead you to one. A lead had emerged from Kansas City, a man whose handwriting had been flagged as a possible match during the broader investigation. The handwriting expert Kitka examined that lead carefully and eliminated it. The Kansas City connection was not the connection. The man they were looking for was somewhere else. But where? Somewhere in San Francisco, or somewhere beyond it. Somewhere that the circulars printed with his description had not yet reached, or had reached without result. Was the man who called himself Bennett when he was at the restaurant in Hawkins when he was signing rental agreements, and something else entirely, presumably, when he was living whatever version of an ordinary life he had constructed for himself around the edges of what he did in private. And then a name surfaced. A name attached to a face and a history and a set of behaviors that made investigators lean forward in their chairs and look at each other with the particular expression that passes between people who believe they may have just found what they have been looking for. The name was Charles B. Hadley, and what they found when they began to pull on that thread would shake the entire city. Charles B. Hadley was, by all outward appearances, a working man. He had been employed as a clerk at a newspaper office, the kind of position that placed him, day after day, in the world of print and publication, in the world of advertisements and announcements and the ordinary machinery by which information moved through a city. He was not a rich man. He was not a prominent man. He was the kind of man who occupied the middle spaces of a city like San Francisco without drawing particular attention. Not too successful to be remarkable, not too poor to be invisible, just someone who went about his work and came home and existed within the routines that ordinary lives are built upon. Or so it appeared. Because the investigators who began to look into Charles B. Hadley found, almost immediately, that the surface of his life did not hold under examination. The first crack appeared in the matter of his accounts at the newspaper office. He had been, by the discovery of the investigators, short in his accounts, meaning that money that should have been there was not there, that the figures did not balance, that somewhere between the newspaper's finances and the records kept by its clerk, a discrepancy existed that suggested Charles B. Hadley had been helping himself to funds that belonged to someone else. This was not a minor matter. This was embezzlement, quietly conducted but real, and it spoke to a character that was comfortable with deception, comfortable with the performance of honesty while privately doing something else entirely. And then there was the other name. Because Charles B. Hadley, it turned out, was not actually using his real name. Or at least, the name Charles B. Hadley was not the name he had been born with. His real name, the name that existed in records that predated his current life in San Francisco, was Charlie Start. He had at some point shed that name and taken on another, reinventing himself in the way that people sometimes do when they want to leave something behind, when the name they were born with has become connected to things they would prefer not to carry into their next chapter. Charlie Start. And what was attached to that name, in the records that investigators managed to locate, was something that made the blood run cold. Because Charles B. Hadley, born Charlie Start, had a prior history that included an assault upon a young girl, a 15-year-old girl, the same age as Nora Fuller. An assault that had not resulted in the kind of consequence that might have prevented what came later, that had instead been absorbed into the general record of a man moving through the world under one name and then another, always managing to stay one step ahead of the full weight of what he had done. So here was what the investigators now had. A man who used false names. A man who was an embezzler. A man who had previously assaulted a girl the same age as the victim. A man whose initials, CBH, matched precisely the initials written on the mattress in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street. C.B. Hawkins. Charlie B. Hadley. CBH. That alignment of initials was not conclusive evidence in itself. Initials can be coincidental, and a competent defense would certainly argue that point. But in combination with everything else, with the embezzlement and the prior assault and the false name and the known history of deception, it was the kind of alignment that made investigators feel they were standing very close to the truth. And then there was what his girlfriend told them. Her name was Ollie Blasier. She had been in a relationship with Charles B. Hadley, had been close to him in the domestic way of people who share a life. And when the investigators came to her with questions, she told them things that she perhaps had been carrying for weeks with the particular weight of someone who has seen something they cannot unsee and does not know what to do with the knowing. She had found clothing belonging to Hadley that was stained with blood. She had noticed it. She had perhaps asked about it, or perhaps had not asked, had simply observed, and then watched as Hadley disposed of the clothing. Burned it, destroyed it, removed it from the world with the specific urgency of someone for whom that clothing had become a liability. She had also watched as he destroyed a hat. A plug hat, the kind of broad-brimmed hat that could have served, in combination with a false mustache, as part of a disguise, part of the costume that transformed one man into another. Gone. Burned. As gone as the clothing. The bloodstained clothes. The destroyed hat. These details, coming from the woman who had lived with him, who had been present in his domestic space in the days following January 11th, 1902, landed in the investigation like stones dropped into still water, sending circles outward in every direction. Investigators also established that Charles B. Hadley was, in his ordinary life, clean-shaven. He did not have a mustache. The man seen at the popular restaurant, the man the staff called Tenderloin, he had a brown mustache, well-kept and deliberate. If Hadley was that man, he had worn the mustache as a disguise. And investigators, following up on this possibility, found evidence that Hadley had purchased a false mustache. A theatrical supply, something that could be applied and removed, that would change the face a witness saw and describe back to police, that would create a layer of uncertainty between the man at the restaurant and the man who sat across from investigators in an ordinary chair in an ordinary room answering questions with whatever version of calm he could maintain. Hadley, with a false brown mustache. Hadley, in a silk hat. Hadley, eating only the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks at the popular restaurant. Hadley as John Bennett. Hadley as C.B. Hawkins. Hadley as Charlie Start. A man of many faces and many names. All of them worn in service of a plan that had ended in a room on Sutter Street with a 15-year-old girl who had trusted him. The investigators brought Hadley's photograph, altered to include a mustache, as he would have appeared to the restaurant staff, to the witnesses who had seen Tenderloin at the popular restaurant. This was standard investigative practice, or as standard as such things were in 1902. Show the witnesses an image, see if they recognize the man. The results were mixed. Some witnesses thought it might be him. Some were uncertain. The identifications were not the clean, definitive confirmations that investigators might have hoped for. But there was one witness whose response carried particular weight. F.W. Crone, the restaurant owner. The man who had watched Tenderloin come and go, who had observed him at his table with the silk hat and the brown mustache and the particular habit of ordering only the one cut of steak. Crone looked at the photograph of Charles B. Hadley, altered to include the mustache, and said, "No, not him." This was not the answer the investigators wanted. This was the complication, the wrench thrown into the machinery at the moment when everything had seemed to be assembling toward a conclusion. The restaurant owner, the primary witness who had the most consistent and detailed exposure to Tenderloin, looked at the picture of Charles B. Hadley and said it was not the man. What did this mean? It could mean that Hadley was innocent, that the alignment of his initials and his prior assault and his destroyed clothing and his false mustache purchase was exactly what it appeared to be. A terrible coincidence, a collection of suspicious details that pointed toward a man who was in fact not the killer. That John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins were someone else entirely, someone who had eluded the investigation completely and might continue to elude it indefinitely. Or it could mean that the disguise had worked, that Hadley, with his false mustache and his silk hat, had so altered his appearance that even a man who had seen him regularly at his table could not reconcile the disguised face with the ordinary face. That the costume had done exactly what it was designed to do. Create enough distance between the person and their appearance that identification became uncertain, became deniable, became the kind of thing that a defense attorney could use to create reasonable doubt in a jury's mind. Or it could mean something in between. That Crone's memory, after weeks of having Tenderloin's face described and discussed and speculated about in newspapers and in conversation, had become contaminated by those descriptions in ways that made his identification unreliable, that the witness he had been on the day he saw Tenderloin sit down and order his steak was not quite the same witness he was now. The investigation did not stop. The investigation could not stop. Because wherever Charles B. Hadley was, he was not in San Francisco anymore. He had left. Quietly, without fanfare, without any dramatic gesture of flight, Charles B. Hadley had departed from the city. He had not cleaned out his bank account. The money he had there was left untouched, which was strange in itself, the kind of detail that suggested either that he had left in more of a hurry than he wanted to appear to have left in, or that he had other resources, money kept elsewhere that would sustain him, or that he had some reason for abandoning the account that connected to a deeper calculation investigators could not yet see. Circulars describing him were printed and distributed. His description went out across the country, to Denver, which had already been mentioned in connection with the newspaper scrap in the apartment, to Kansas City, to cities up and down the Pacific coast. Law enforcement in other jurisdictions was asked to watch for him. No one found him. Charles B. Hadley, born Charlie Start, the man the investigators believed was most likely to be John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins in Tenderloin, had walked out of San Francisco and into whatever came next, and the city was left holding its questions without answers, holding its grief without resolution, holding the memory of a girl from Fulton Street who had deserved better from a world that had not found a way to give it to her. And San Francisco was angry. The city was watching. The newspapers were printing. And what the newspapers were about to do, in the weeks that followed, in the months of coverage that turned Nora Fuller's case into the biggest crime story San Francisco had seen in years, would both illuminate the truth and complicate the search for it in ways that the investigators could not fully control. The press had arrived. And when the press arrived in a city already gripped by fear, things began to move in directions that were not always toward justice. The San Francisco newspapers of 1902 were not like the careful, measured publications that we might ideally imagine a free press to be. They were competitive and aggressive and hungry for the kind of story that kept readers buying papers day after day, week after week. And the murder of Nora Fuller was exactly that kind of story. It had everything. A young victim, sympathetic and innocent, from a poor family with a tragic history. A killer who had never been caught, who had used false names and false mustaches and a carefully prepared room in the dark. A city full of fear and outrage and the particular appetite that grief generates, the need to understand, to find a face to attach to the horror, to have someone to look at and say, "There, that is the one who did this." The newspapers fed that appetite. They printed everything. They named names, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly, and the men whose names appeared in print in connection with the Nora Fuller investigation found that the connection, once made in a newspaper, was almost impossible to undo. The suggestion of involvement became its own kind of verdict, delivered publicly, without trial, without due process, without the moderating influence of a jury that had actually examined the evidence. You were named, and then you were named again. And then people on the street began to look at you differently, and the job you had held was suddenly less secure, and the life you had been living before your name appeared in a newspaper in connection with a murdered girl was simply not available to you anymore. Dozens of men were publicly interrogated in this way, either formally by investigators who were following whatever leads the newspapers had generated, or informally by the newspapers themselves, which in 1902 had a culture of journalism that would today be considered extraordinarily invasive and frequently harmful. Lives were disrupted. Reputations were destroyed. Men who had nothing to do with Nora Fuller's death found themselves caught in the machinery of public attention because they resembled the description or lived near the address or had some coincidental connection to a name or a place that had appeared in the coverage. The governor of California came under pressure to offer a reward. The figure discussed was $5,000, a substantial sum in 1902, enough to represent a meaningful incentive for anyone with information to come forward. The push for a reward reflected the public's frustration that weeks had passed and the killer remained at large, that Charles B. Hadley had disappeared and the circulars had gone out and no one had found him, that the investigation appeared to be producing noise without resolution. Whether the reward materially advanced the investigation is difficult to say now. What it certainly did was generate a fresh wave of tips and claims and sightings, most of which led nowhere, some of which consumed investigative time and resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. This is the double-edged nature of public rewards in criminal cases. They broaden the information pool, but they also flood it. And the work of sorting the genuine from the wishful and the mistaken and the fraudulent is itself a significant burden. Meanwhile, there was the question of what the investigation actually had that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. Because evidence and suspicion are different things. The investigators had their suspicions. They had the alignment of initials. They had the prior assault. They had the embezzlement. They had the blood-stained clothes burned by a woman who had since given investigators a statement. They had the false mustache purchase. They had the handwriting analysis connecting C.B. Hawkins to the man who had placed the advertisement. They had the behavioral pattern that Madge Graham had described. The telephone calls, the theater tickets, the cultivation of a relationship with a vulnerable girl. But what they did not have was Charles B. Hadley himself. And without him, the case could not proceed to the conclusion that justice required. In the absence of an arrest, the city began to do what cities do when fear goes unresolved. It turned the fear back on itself. Parents became more watchful. Young women found the world around them had narrowed slightly. The freedom of movement that any person takes for granted having contracted in response to the awareness that a predator had moved through the streets without anyone seeing the danger until it was too late. The popular restaurant, the address on Sutter Street, the name Tenderloin. These became part of San Francisco's vocabulary of dread, the way certain names and places in any city become associated with its moments of darkest history. There is something else worth considering here, something that the city of San Francisco in 1902 was perhaps not fully equipped to articulate, but that we can see clearly from where we stand. The investigation of Nora Fuller's death was shaped, at every stage, by assumptions about who she was and what her death meant. Poor, 15, looking for work, the daughter of a woman twice divorced, living in a modest house on Fulton Street. These facts about Nora were not irrelevant to her case, but they were interpreted in ways that both helped and hindered the investigation. On the helpful side, the sympathy generated for Nora, the newspaper's portrait of her as an innocent girl from a struggling family, dreaming of independence, lured by a fraudulent job offer, kept public attention on the case and created the kind of sustained pressure that made investigators continue working even when leads dried up. Nora's story was told in a way that humanized her, and that humanization mattered. It kept her from being forgotten. On the other hand, the early framing of the case as a simple predator-victim story, stranger with a fake job offer, naive girl who answered an advertisement, had required revision when Madge Graham came forward and described the longer relationship with Bennett. And that revision was uncomfortable, because it introduced a complexity that did not fit the neat story the newspapers had been telling, a complexity that raised questions about Nora's own awareness of the relationship, about the nature of what had existed between her and the man who called himself Bennett, about whether she had in some way been complicit in her own access to danger. These are the kinds of questions that get asked about female victims. They were asked in 1902. They are still asked today. And the asking of them, whatever investigative value they might theoretically have, also serves the function of distributing some portion of the horror onto the victim herself, of suggesting that if she had been different, if she had been more careful or more suspicious or less trusting, things might have gone differently. This is false. It is a way of managing the fear generated by the fact that predators are often precisely the people who appear safe, who appear trustworthy, who have invested significant time and effort in appearing exactly that way specifically because the appearance of trustworthiness is the mechanism of the trap. Nora Fuller was not naive. She was groomed. There is an enormous difference, and the difference matters, and it mattered in 1902 just as it matters now. Even if the language available to describe it was not yet sophisticated enough to make the distinction clearly. The investigation pressed forward through the spring of 1902 and into the warmer months that followed. San Francisco bloomed and buzzed, and the Bay sparkled, and the newspapers found new stories to pursue, though they never entirely let go of Nora Fuller's case. It remained in the background, a standing item, a case that might yet yield a resolution if only the right thread could be found and pulled. Charles B. Hadley was not found. Not in the spring. Not in the summer. Not in the months that followed. He had become one of those figures that cases like this sometimes produce, a primary suspect who had successfully evaded the apparatus of law enforcement in an era when that apparatus was limited by geography and technology and the fundamental challenge of finding a person who did not want to be found in a country large enough to absorb an almost unlimited number of disappearances. He had money somewhere, or he had found work somewhere under yet another name, or he had crossed a border and begun again in a jurisdiction where the circulars from San Francisco had not reached or had been noted without generating action. The theories about what had happened to him were several. Some believed he had killed himself, that the weight of what he had done, or the certainty that capture was coming, had led him to take his own life somewhere private and hidden, in a way that would leave no body easily found. This would have explained the untouched bank account. A man who does not intend to survive does not need his money, and it would have provided a kind of resolution, however unsatisfying, to a city that needed someone to blame. Others believed he had simply reinvented himself again, that the man who had already shed the name Charlie Start for Charles B. Hadley, who had worn the name C.B. Hawkins for a rental agreement and John Bennett for a restaurant meeting, had simply reached into whatever store of false identities he possessed and pulled out another one, and walked into a new city and a new life, and was, even at that moment, sitting somewhere eating the tenderloin of a porterhouse steak under a new name, in a new restaurant, with new people who had no idea who was sitting across from them. And a third theory was darker still, that he was alive and moving, and that somewhere in the country there was another girl who would eventually answer an advertisement, or receive a postal card, or meet a man at a restaurant who wore a silk hat and a brown mustache and asked quiet, careful questions in a voice that sounded perfectly reasonable, and that the story of Nora Fuller had not ended in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street, but had only closed its first chapter. None of these theories could be proven. None of them could be disproven. They existed, all of them simultaneously, in the space that is left when justice does not arrive. The uncomfortable space of uncertainty where the mind reaches for conclusions and finds only questions, where the need to understand meets the impossibility of knowing, and what you are left with is the weight of everything that remains unresolved. And Nora Fuller remained unresolved. Her family remained without the closure that a verdict would have brought. Her killer, whether Charles B. Hadley or someone else entirely, was never formally charged, never stood in a courtroom, never heard a jury deliver a verdict that would attach legal consequence to what had been done in that dark room on Sutter Street. The case went cold. Cases do, eventually, even the ones that cities carry for a long time. The newspapers moved on. The investigators moved on, not by choice, but by the necessity of other crimes requiring attention. And Nora Fuller, 15 years old, Eleanor Parline, daughter of a man who had disappeared at sea and a woman who had survived too much in a city that had failed to protect her, Nora Fuller became one of history's cold cases. A name in a file, a photograph in an archive, a story that was told, intensely for a while, and then less and less, until the telling almost stopped. Almost, but not quite. Because here we are, over a century later, sitting together in the dark, you in your bed or your chair, with your headphones or your phone, somewhere in the world that Nora Fuller never had the chance to see. And we are saying her name. We are telling her story. And that matters. That has always mattered. Let us keep going. Because there are still threads to pull, still questions to sit with, still the full weight of what happened in San Francisco in the winter of 1902 to bring to light. The theories are coming. The final reckoning is coming. But first, let us talk about what the evidence actually tells us, and what it does not. Let us be honest about the limits of what anyone can know with certainty about the murder of Nora Fuller. That honesty is the best thing we can offer her now. Theodore Kitka sat at a table in a room filled with documents, and did something that few people in 1902 could have done with the same precision and authority. He compared handwriting. He had been doing this work for years, the careful, patient, almost meditative work of analyzing the marks that a person's hand makes on paper, the particular pressure of a pen tip, the angle of letters, the spacing between words, the tiny unconscious habits that accumulate in a person's writing over years of practice until they are as unique and as identifying as a face. Kitka was, by the standards of his era, an expert, and what he had been given to examine was the potential bridge between two identities. On one side of that bridge was the rental agreement signed at 2211 Sutter Street by the man who had called himself C.B. Hawkins. On the other side was the written portion of the newspaper advertisement, the actual handwritten notation that had accompanied the placing of the ad, the handwriting of whoever had initiated the paper trail that led Nora Fuller to the restaurant, and then to the vacant lot, and then to wherever she had gone next. Kitka looked at both specimens. He looked at them for a long time, in the way that experts look at things, not just glancing, not just noting the obvious, but going down into the details, the sub-details, the micro-patterns that exist below the level of conscious observation. He was looking for the markers that the conscious mind cannot fake, the ones that appear in handwriting the way a particular gait appears in the way a person walks, revealing, indelible, as much a part of the person as the voice they speak in. And he found them. The same hand, he concluded, had written both documents. The man who had rented the apartment as C.B. Hawkins was the same man who had placed the advertisement as John Bennett. The names were different. The hand was the same. This was significant. This was the kind of finding that moved a case forward in a measurable way, because it tied together two separate aliases and established that the person behind them was one person, one plan, one deliberately constructed architecture of deception. It narrowed the universe of who the investigators were looking for. It gave the investigation a center of gravity. 32,000 address change cards had been examined as part of the process of eliminating other possible matches. The number is almost staggering to contemplate. The sheer labor of it, the hours of comparison, the sustained concentration required to move through that volume of handwriting samples and say, one by one, no, not this one, no, not this one either. Kitka and whoever assisted him in the work had essentially conducted a vast process of exclusion, narrowing and narrowing until what remained was the conclusion. These two documents, and no others in the examined sample, share a handwriting origin. The Kansas City lead, a suspect identified in that city whose handwriting had been put forward as a possible match, was examined and eliminated. The Kansas City man was not the man. Whatever other reasons there might have been to look at him, his handwriting was not the bridge. The investigation turned back to the evidence it had closer to home. And closer to home, the evidence kept pointing at Charles B. Hadley. It is worth pausing here and thinking carefully about what a genuine investigation would have made of all of this if Charles B. Hadley had been apprehended and brought to trial. Because the evidence against him, while suggestive and in some ways compelling, had significant gaps. The handwriting analysis connected C.B. Hawkins to the advertisement, but it did not directly connect either of those to Charles B. Hadley as a living, breathing individual, not without additional steps of proof that would need to withstand cross-examination. The prior assault was relevant as character evidence, the kind of thing that paints a picture, but a defense attorney would argue that a prior offense, however troubling, does not make a man guilty of a specific later crime. The blood-stained clothes burned by Ollie Blazer were gone, destroyed, available as testimony about behavior, but not as physical evidence in themselves. The restaurant owner's non-identification was a genuine problem. F.W. Crone, who had the most sustained exposure to the man called Tenderloin, who had watched him come and go with enough regularity to give him a nickname, who would presumably be the prosecution's strongest witness to the suspect's appearance and behavior. Crone looked at the photograph and said, "Not him." That is a significant problem in a courtroom. That is the kind of witness testimony that defense attorneys use as crowbars. And then there was the mixed identification from other witnesses. Some thought the mustached photograph might be Hadley. Some were not sure. The uncertainty is understandable. The disguise had been crafted precisely to introduce uncertainty, but uncertainty is not the foundation of a conviction, and in 1902 as now, the standard of proof required for a criminal verdict was higher than the preponderance of suggestive circumstantial evidence. So what did the investigators actually have? They had a strong suspicion, built on a coherent and internally consistent narrative, supported by multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence that, taken together, pointed toward Charles B. Hadley as the most likely candidate for John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins and Tenderloin. They had a prior offense, an embezzlement history, an initials match, a false mustache, blood-stained clothing described by someone who had lived with him. They had the handwriting expert's conclusion connecting the two aliases. They had the behavioral pattern described by Madge Graham and confirmed by the grocery store owner. What they did not have was a confession. What they did not have was the man. In the absence of both, the city of San Francisco was left in that particular limbo that unsolved cases occupy. Not quite closed, because there was a primary suspect, but not resolved, because that suspect could not be found, and without him in custody the case could not move forward through the legal process that resolution required. This limbo is its own kind of suffering. Ask any family that has been through it. The investigators know, or believe they know, who did this. The family knows, or believes they know, who did this. But the knowing without the proving, the believing without the being able to say so in a courtroom with consequences attached. This is a wound that does not close properly, that stays open and tender for years and decades, that never quite allows the grief to settle into the shape that grief eventually needs to settle into for the surviving people to be able to move forward. Nora Fuller's family lived in that limbo. Her mother, who had already lost so much, the husband who had vanished at sea, the stability of a marriage that had not held, the modest but real foundation of a life on Fulton Street, now lost her daughter in the most brutal and final way, and then lost the possibility of justice, and was left holding all of that loss without a resolution that the law and a courtroom might have provided. We do not know, from the historical record available to us now, very much about what happened to Nora's mother in the years that followed. The newspapers had documented her grief in the early months of 1902, had described her distress and her hope, and eventually her mourning. And then the newspapers had moved on, and the private life of a poor woman in a modest house on Fulton Street had receded from public view. She is one of the people in this story who deserves more space than history gave her. The mother, always, the person whose loss is total and whose story continues long after the newspapers have gone to press with other things. What we know is that the case was never solved. That Charles B. Hadley was never found, never charged, never tried. That his name remained in the files as the primary suspect, but never became a conviction. And that Nora Fuller, Eleanor Parline, born in China in 1886, the daughter of a man the sea took and a woman life kept bearing down on, was buried without the formal acknowledgement that what had been done to her had been answered. This is the most difficult part of a cold case to sit with. The evidence, the suspect, the gap between them, the gap that justice never crossed. Let us take a breath here. Let us just be still for a moment with what we know and what we do not know, and let the weight of it settle before we move into what comes next. If you are still awake, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go to the comments section below this video and just say where you're watching from, and maybe what you're thinking right now. This community has the most thoughtful people I have encountered anywhere online, and nights like this one, nights when the story is hard and the questions don't have answers, are exactly when I love to hear from you. And if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It is how you help this channel continue doing exactly this. Telling the stories that deserve to be told, in the way that they deserve to be told. Because there is more to this story. There are the theories, 3 of them, each coherent, each supported by some portion of the evidence, each pointing toward a different version of what really happened in San Francisco in January of 1902. And there is the final question, the one that never goes away when a case like this remains unsolved. Was the killer ever stopped? Did he do this again? Is there another girl, somewhere in the records of some other city, whose story we have not yet connected to the man with the silk hat and the brown mustache who ate only the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks? We are going to go there. We are going to sit with all of it. But first, let us talk about what made this particular man, whoever he truly was, so extraordinarily dangerous, and what the danger looked like from the inside. There is a word that comes up repeatedly when investigators and analysts and students of criminal behavior talk about a certain kind of predator, a word that seems almost too ordinary for the extraordinary harm it describes. The word is organized. To say that someone is organized, in the language of criminal profiling, is to say something profound about how their mind works, about the relationship between impulse and control, between desire and patience, between what they want and how long they are willing to wait and plan and prepare before they allow themselves to reach for it. The man behind the murder of Nora Fuller, whether his name was Charles B. Hadley or whether he was someone else entirely, whether the restaurant owner's non-identification was accurate or whether the disguise had simply done its work too well, this man was organized. Profoundly, methodically, unusually organized, in ways that revealed a mind quite capable of sustained deception over extended periods of time. Consider the timeline. The advertisement had been placed before the postal card was sent. The postal card was sent before the restaurant meeting was arranged. The apartment was rented 3 days before the meeting took place. The mattress and bed linens were ordered, delivered at night, positioned in the room. The room was checked for its suitability, dark enough, isolated enough, far enough from anything that would interfere. No gas, no light, no food, because he was not planning for comfort, was not planning for any stay of duration that required sustenance. He was planning for one night, one specific night, and everything was in its place before that night arrived. This is not how impulsive violence works. Impulsive violence is chaotic. It leaves evidence. It makes noise. It happens in the place where the impulse occurs, not in a room that has been prepared in advance on a different street on a different day. Impulsive violence does not involve false mustaches and silk hats and restaurant reconnaissance over multiple visits and a handwriting expert who finds the same hand across two separately placed documents. Impulsive violence does not use two separate aliases for two separate components of the same plan. What this man had done required time and patience and the ability to hold multiple threads of a plan in his mind simultaneously without losing track of any of them. The advertisement, the postal card, the restaurant, the fake job address that turned out to be a vacant lot, the apartment on Sutter Street, the mattress, the night delivery, the burned hat, the burned clothes. He had thought through the aftermath as carefully as he had thought through the approach. He had already been thinking, before January 11th, about what he would need to destroy after January 11th. This level of premeditation is rare. It is the kind of thing that criminal investigators encounter in cases that stay with them for years, that continue to occupy a place in the mind long after the official work of the investigation has concluded. Because encountering a mind organized in this way, encountering the evidence of a plan this complete, this patient, this thoroughly thought through, changes something in how you understand the geography of danger. It expands it. It makes the world feel less predictable, less safe, more full of hidden architecture. And yet, despite all of this planning, despite the false names and the burned evidence and the careful minimization of physical traces left behind, he had not been entirely successful. The mattress had his initials. The handwriting had survived on two documents. The restaurant staff remembered him. Madge Graham remembered the phone calls and the theater tickets. The grocery store owner confirmed the pattern of calls. Ollie Blasier had seen the blood and had watched the hat and the clothing burn. He had been careful. He had not been careful enough. The question the investigation was never able to definitively answer was whether the person whose carefulness had almost worked was Charles B. Hadley. But let us, for a moment, think through what the evidence suggests if we accept that it was. Charles B. Hadley had used two separate aliases, John Bennett for the social face of the scheme, C.B. Hawkins for the logistical face. John Bennett was the warm, accessible identity, the one that appeared in the postal card and at the restaurant, the one that Nora knew and perhaps trusted. C.B. Hawkins was colder, more transactional, the name signed on a lease agreement with a false hotel address and a month's rent in cash, the name of someone conducting business rather than building a relationship. The split between the two aliases suggests a sophisticated understanding of how to compartmentalize, how to keep the emotional manipulation of the victim separate from the logistical execution of the plan, how to make sure that if one alias was discovered, it would not automatically lead to the other. He had also understood the importance of witness perception management. The brown mustache was not just a disguise. It was a specific disguise, calculated to create a consistent and memorable description that would lead investigators toward a man with a brown mustache and away from a man who was normally clean-shaven. The silk hat and the refined clothing were part of the same calculation. Present a particular image. Let that image be what witnesses remember and describe, and then remove the elements of that image when you step back into your ordinary life. Become a different person simply by removing the costume, confident that the distance between the costumed version and the ordinary version would be enough to create identification uncertainty. And it had almost worked. Even Ollie Blasier, who had lived with him, had not apparently understood the full scope of what was happening until after the fact. Whatever he had told her, whatever version of himself he had presented in the domestic space of their shared life, it had been convincing enough that the blood-stained clothes and the burning hat were the first cracks in the performance she was given to observe. And even then, the question remains, what did she think when she saw those things? Did she know? Did she suspect and choose not to pursue the knowledge? Did she not connect what she was seeing with the story that had been consuming the newspapers for weeks? We cannot know what Ollie Blasier knew or when she knew it or what she chose to do with the knowing. She spoke to investigators. She gave them what she gave them, and what she gave them was real. the blood-stained clothes, the burning, the mustache purchase, but it was also filtered through whatever her relationship with Charles B. Hadley had been, whatever she felt about him, whatever calculation she was making about what to say and what to hold back. This is the way real cases work. They are not clean. They do not arrive with a neat package of evidence and a straightforward path from evidence to conclusion. They are made of partial accounts and imperfect memories and relationships that complicate everything. And the job of making something coherent out of all of that, making something that can withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom, or at the very least the scrutiny of history, is hard and sometimes impossible. Nora Fuller's case made it impossible. The primary suspect was gone. The evidence was circumstantial. The investigation had done what it could, and what it could had not been enough to produce an outcome. So let us now turn to the three major theories, the three frameworks through which the murder of Nora Fuller has been understood and interpreted across the decades since 1902. And let us sit with each of them honestly, giving each one the weight it deserves, and acknowledging the evidence that supports it and the evidence that complicates it. The first theory, the most widely accepted one among the investigators who worked the case, is the one that places Charles B. Hadley at the center of everything. This theory holds that Hadley, born Charlie Start, an embezzler who had already assaulted a girl of Nora's age, a man comfortable with deception and with the use of false identities, was John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins and Tenderloin, all in one. That he had identified Nora Fuller as a target, had spent weeks or months cultivating her through the telephone calls and the theater tickets that Madge Graham described, had then constructed the elaborate apparatus of the advertisement and the postal card and the restaurant meeting and the fake job address, had led her to the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street, and had murdered her there on the night of January 11th, 1902. This theory is supported by the alignment of his initials with CBH on the mattress. It is supported by the prior assault of a girl the same age as the victim. It is supported by the embezzlement and the general comfort with deception. It is supported by the blood-stained clothes and the burning hat described by Ollie Blazer. It is supported by the false mustache purchase. It is supported by the handwriting analysis, though the handwriting analysis requires additional steps to connect to Hadley specifically. And it is supported by the fact that he disappeared. Guilty men often run. Innocent men sometimes run too, particularly if they fear being falsely accused. But the timing of Hadley's departure, the money left untouched in the bank, the quiet exit from the city, is consistent with flight, and flight is consistent with guilt. Against this theory stands F.W. Crone, the restaurant owner, who looked at the photograph and said, "Not him." That single piece of testimony is the most significant obstacle to this theory, and it has never been fully resolved. This is where we will rest for now, holding the first theory in mind, supported, complicated, uncertain, while the others wait to be considered. The night is still long enough to hold all three. The second theory is, in some ways, the most disturbing, not because it is inherently more grotesque than the first, but because of what it implies about the nature of the predator and about how many more people might have encountered him without knowing the danger they were in. This theory holds that the man who called himself John Bennett and C.B. Hawkins was not Charles B. Hadley at all. That F.W. Crone, the restaurant owner, was correct in his non-identification. That Hadley was a circumstantially suspicious man whose initials and prior offense and comfort with deception made him a compelling suspect, but who was not actually the person who rented the apartment and placed the advertisement and led Nora Fuller to her death. That the real killer, whoever he was, remained entirely unknown, entirely outside the investigation's reach, never identified, never named, possibly never even brought to the edge of suspicion, moving through San Francisco and beyond it without any mechanism of accountability ever reaching him. This theory is supported primarily by Crone's testimony. The restaurant owner had the most consistent and sustained exposure to the man the staff called Tenderloin. He had seen him sit at his table repeatedly, had observed him from across the restaurant, had spoken with his staff about him, had been in the position of a person whose professional context required him to be observant about the people who came through his door. If Crone looked at the photograph of Charles B. Hadley and said not him, that carries weight. Not conclusive weight. Not the kind of weight that would have been sufficient in a courtroom, necessarily. but the weight of an experienced observer saying something definitive about someone he had reason to observe carefully. If this theory is correct, then the real killer was someone significantly more sophisticated and significantly more invisible than Charles B. Hadley. Because the planning involved in the murder of Nora Fuller was, as we have discussed, extraordinary. It was not the planning of a man who was an opportunistic embezzler. It was the planning of someone for whom this kind of carefully constructed predation was, if not routine, at least practiced. Someone who understood intimately the mechanics of creating a false identity, maintaining it consistently across multiple encounters, preparing a location in advance, managing witness exposure through the use of a disguise, and then disappearing after the fact in a way that left no physical trail. This suggests, and this is where the theory becomes most disturbing, the possibility of a serial predator. Not in the sense of a man who had committed an identical crime before and would be found in a neat pattern of murders across multiple cities, but in the broader sense of someone for whom this kind of careful predation of vulnerable girls was a pattern of behavior, a compulsion managed through planning and execution rather than impulse. A man who had done something like this before, who might do something like it again, who might be doing it right now, in some other city, in some other apartment rented with cash and a false name. The scrap of Denver Post found in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street supports this theory more than it supports the Hadley theory, in a particular way. If Hadley was the killer, the Denver Post scrap is harder to explain. It requires either that Hadley had connections to Denver that the investigation did not fully explore, or that the scrap was coincidental, having come from somewhere else through some route unrelated to the killer. But if the killer was someone else entirely, someone who did travel between San Francisco and Denver, someone who moved along the routes that connected the cities of the American West in that era, then the Denver Post scrap becomes a geographic fingerprint. A small and inadvertent trace of a man who moved through the world along a particular trajectory and had, in this one small moment, left evidence of it. The Kansas City investigation, which had briefly produced a lead and then been eliminated by the handwriting analysis, suggests that the investigation itself was aware of the possibility that the killer was someone with connections across multiple cities. The effort to find him in Kansas City, the examination of that lead, and its careful elimination. This reflects an investigative instinct that the man they were looking for was not a local actor confined to San Francisco, but someone who moved. If Bennett was not Hadley, then where is Bennett now? That is the question this theory cannot answer. If he was never identified in 1902, then he is a face without a name in the historical record. A brown mustache and a silk hat and a habit of eating only the tenderloin of porterhouse steaks and a mind that could plan a murder 3 days in advance and walk away from it without leaving anything that could definitively identify him. He is, in this theory, one of history's escaped predators, real, knowable in his habits and his methods, but not in his name and his face. A person who existed and acted and caused irreparable harm, and then receded into the anonymity that careful planning and the limitations of 1902 investigative technology made available to him. This is the most uncomfortable place a case can leave us, with a monster who has no name. Because without a name, there is nothing to hold accountable. There is no face to look at and say, this was the one. There is only the method, the pattern, the behavior, all of it documented in the evidence left behind, none of it attached to a specific living person who could be made to answer for it. And the third theory is perhaps the most nuanced of the three, and the one that requires the most careful handling. It is the theory that Nora Fuller knew her killer, knew him well, that the relationship Madge Graham described, the telephone calls, the theater tickets, the secret meetings, was real and substantial, and that on January 11th, 1902, Nora Fuller did not go to a restaurant to meet a stranger about a job. She went to meet someone she trusted, someone she may have cared about in the complex and unequal way that a vulnerable girl can come to care about a man who has invested time and attention in making himself important to her. This theory does not diminish what was done to her. It does not suggest that she bore any responsibility for what happened. It situates the crime within the context of what we now call grooming, which is the systematic manipulation of a young person's trust and affection for the purpose of exploitation, and which is recognized today as a distinct and serious form of predatory behavior that begins long before the physical crime it is designed to facilitate. In this theory, the advertisement and the postal card and the restaurant meeting were the final stage of something that had been developing for months. The fake job offer was a mechanism, a way to give the meeting a pretext that could be explained to Nora's family, a reason for her to go to the restaurant that did not require her to reveal the nature of her relationship with the man she was going to meet. She was going to a job interview. That was what she told her family. But what she may actually have been going to was a meeting with someone she already knew. Someone who had promised her something, or told her something, or made her believe in something that made the risk of that January afternoon seem, from inside her perspective, manageable, even safe. She was wrong, of course, in the most terrible and final way. But the wrongness of her assessment was not evidence of naivete. It was evidence of how successful the grooming had been, of how thoroughly this man had managed her perception of who he was and what the relationship between them meant. She walked into the restaurant with trust, and what she trusted had been carefully manufactured to lead her exactly where she went. This theory has the advantage of explaining why Madge Graham's account, the calls, the tickets, the secret meetings, seems to coexist somewhat uneasily with the image of Nora as a purely passive victim of a stranger's trap. It integrates the two pictures. It says, yes, she knew him, and yes, she trusted him, and yes, that trust was the trap, and the advertisement and the postal card were not his method but his cover. The public-facing story that made her departure from her house on January 11th look ordinary. A girl going to a job interview. Nothing more. Whether this theory requires Hadley to be the killer, or whether it is compatible with the second theory, that the killer was someone else entirely, depends on which additional elements you weigh most heavily. The phone calls and the theater tickets and the secret meetings were real, described by multiple sources. The man behind them could have been Hadley. He could have been someone else. The third theory does not resolve that question. It only insists that whoever it was, his relationship with Nora Fuller was not the one-time encounter of a stranger and a job applicant, but something longer and deeper and more deliberately constructed. 3 theories, each with evidence behind it. None of them capable, in the absence of Charles B. Hadley and a functioning criminal justice process, of resolving into a verdict. And this is where we have remained for over a century. Nora Fuller was murdered on January 11th, 1902. The room was found on February 8th, 1902. Charles B. Hadley was named as the primary suspect and was never found. The case was never formally closed and was never formally solved. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of those facts, somewhere in the space between what is known and what is not, between the evidence that exists and the verdict that never came, the story of a 15-year-old girl from Fulton Street in San Francisco still waits for something it has not yet received. Its name is justice, and we cannot give it to her, not now, not across this distance of time. But we can do the other thing. We can remember. We can say her name. We can hold the story of what happened to her with the care and attention it deserves, and we can think clearly about what it means, and we can choose not to look away. That is what we are doing tonight. That is why we are here. Let us continue. The city of San Francisco, in the months after February 1902, tried to make sense of what had happened the way cities always try to make sense of things that resist easy sense-making. It told itself stories. The newspapers provided the frame, and the public filled in the details according to their own fears and preoccupations. And what emerged was not quite the truth. It never is, when fear does the storytelling, but something adjacent to the truth. Something that addressed the central question of how a thing like this could have happened in a city like theirs. The central question was, as it almost always is in cases involving young female victims, how did she end up there? This is a question that can be asked with genuine investigative intent. As in, what was the mechanism by which she was led from her house on Fulton Street to an apartment on Sutter Street where a man had prepared a mattress for her death? But it can also be asked in a way that is less innocent, in a way that searches for something in the victim's behavior or choices or personality that might explain, even slightly, why this happened to her specifically, as if the answer to that question would provide some protection against it happening to someone else. As if understanding Nora's particular vulnerability would reveal the particular combination of circumstances that had to be present for such a thing to occur, and therefore allow those circumstances to be avoided. This search for an explanatory vulnerability in the victim is one of the oldest and least useful responses to violent crime. It is least useful because it consistently misidentifies the cause. The cause of Nora Fuller's death was not Nora Fuller. It was not her poverty, or her quitting school, or her theatrical aspirations, or the fact that she answered an advertisement, or the phone call she received from a man called Bennett, or the theater tickets, or any combination of those things. Those things were the terrain that a predator navigated. They were not the predator. And the distinction matters enormously, because focusing on the terrain rather than the predator, on Nora's circumstances rather than his calculations, is a way of relocating responsibility, of distributing a portion of the blame onto the victim and thereby reducing, by that portion, the weight of blame carried by the one who actually made the choices. The man who placed the advertisement and wrote the postal card and rented the apartment and purchased the mattress and the sheets and the false mustache. He made choices. Every single step of the way was a choice, a deliberate decision made by a person in full possession of their faculties and aware of what they were doing. Nora Fuller did not make choices that were equivalent to those choices. She made ordinary choices, choices that anyone in her circumstances might have made, choices that reflected the perfectly reasonable hope of a girl who needed work and received what appeared to be a legitimate offer of it. The difference between those choices and his choices is not one of degree. It is categorical. San Francisco's newspapers, in their 1902 coverage, sometimes understood this distinction and sometimes did not. They were products of their time, which meant they were products of a set of assumptions about gender and class and the nature of female virtue that did not always serve female victims well. But they also, at their best, told Nora's story with genuine sympathy and genuine outrage, with the anger of a community that recognized the harm done and demanded accountability, even if the form that demand for accountability sometimes took was imperfect. The sustained public attention to the case, the months of front-page coverage, the pressure on the governor to offer a reward, the public interrogation of dozens of men, reflects a city that took what happened to Nora seriously. This is not nothing. In an era when crimes against poor girls from struggling families were sometimes managed as administrative matters and forgotten, San Francisco did not forget Nora Fuller quickly. She stayed in the newspapers. She stayed in the public consciousness. The case was not allowed to quietly dissolve into the general record of crimes that get committed and never solved and never much discussed after the initial moment of attention passes. This sustained attention was partly the newspaper's commercial interest in a story that sold papers. We should be honest about that. But it was also, partly, something more genuine. The moral seriousness of a community confronting the reality that a specific kind of predator had moved through their city and done a specific thing to a specific child and had not been stopped. That moral seriousness matters. It is what keeps cold cases alive across the decades. It is what brings us to moments like this one, where we are sitting together in the dark and saying Nora Fuller's name and telling her story more than a century after it happened. The sustained attention of a community, however imperfect, however mixed with self-interest and sensationalism, creates a record, and the record is what allows the memory to persist. Let us talk, now, about what the physical evidence in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street tells us about the last hours of Nora Fuller's life. Not to be sensational, not to dwell on the violence for its own sake, but because the physical evidence is a form of testimony. It is the closest thing we have to Nora's own account of what happened to her, and it deserves to be heard carefully. She had eaten an apple. The coroner found the remains of one in her stomach. This is an ordinary and heartbreaking detail. A girl who had eaten a piece of fruit on the last day of her life, in the ordinary way of someone who was hungry and found something to eat. It places her in the world of the living, in the world of ordinary physical experience, right up until the moment when she was taken out of it. There was alcohol in her system, not a large amount, but enough to register. The whiskey bottle in the room suggests how it got there. We cannot know exactly when she drank or how much, or whether it was given to her willingly or offered in a way that she did not understand was meant to incapacitate or relax her. Both possibilities exist. The presence of the whiskey bottle in the room, combined with the absence of any other comfort items, no food, no gas, no light, suggests that the whiskey was there for a specific purpose, part of the plan, not incidental. The cigar butt. Someone had smoked a cigar in that room. It was not Nora. There is no suggestion in the historical record that she smoked cigars, and it would have been extraordinary behavior for a 15-year-old girl of her era and background. It was his. He had sat in that room and smoked a cigar. This is perhaps the detail that most vividly brings him into the space. Not his face, not his name, but his habit. He sat in the dark room with a cigar, and he was there, physically present, in a space he had prepared and furnished and brought her to. He was a person. He breathed. He smoked. He had preferences and habits and a physical body that occupied space. And then he killed her. With his hands. The marks on her throat, the two distinct black marks that the coroner described, were the marks of hands that applied pressure for long enough to end a life. This was not the work of a moment. Strangulation takes time. It requires sustained effort and sustained choice. The choice, repeated across the seconds and minutes required, to continue. This is why strangulation is considered, in the analysis of crime, one of the most personal and deliberate forms of lethal violence. It requires presence. It requires proximity. It requires the sustained decision to not stop. And then he left. He walked out of the apartment, and he pulled the shade down, and he locked the door behind him, and he went back into the city. He perhaps went home. He perhaps ate dinner. He perhaps slept. We do not know. What we know is that the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street sat closed and dark for 27 days, and that the city outside went about its business, and that the man who had walked out of that room continued to move through the world as if the thing he had done was a thing that could simply be left behind, in a dark room, under a pulled shade, and walked away from. The Denver Post scrap. This detail has lingered in the investigation's margins for over a century. Who brought it? When did it enter the room? Was it in the killer's pocket, brought from Denver, or kept from a recent Denver paper? Incidental and meaningless. Just a scrap of newspaper he had grabbed without thinking. Used to light the cigar perhaps, or to wrap something, or simply crumpled in his coat, and never considered until it became evidence. Or was it significant? Did it connect him to a specific time in Denver, a specific event, a specific set of circumstances that might have helped identify him if the investigators had been able to follow it all the way to its source? The historical record does not tell us. The investigation noted the scrap. The investigation flagged the Denver connection. The investigation looked at Kansas City. And then the investigation ran out of thread to pull, and the Denver Post scrap became one of those details that sits in the file without a resolution, holding its potential significance untranslated. The Parrott Building connection, the suggestion that the Denver Post scrap had traveled from the Parrott Building somehow, adds another layer of geographic and social specificity that the investigation tried to follow and could not fully resolve. The Parrott Building was a real building, an address in San Francisco where certain kinds of business and certain kinds of men might be found. Whether the connection was real or a dead end, whether the scrap of newspaper had genuinely passed through that building as part of a traceable chain of custody, is another thing we cannot know with certainty from where we stand now. What we can know is that the evidence, taken in its entirety, describes a man who was careful but not infallible, who planned but did not plan perfectly, who left traces that a better resourced or better equipped investigation in a different era might have followed all the way to a name and a face and a verdict. We did not have that era in 1902, and so the traces remained traces, and the name remained unknown, and the face remained unidentified, and Nora Fuller remained unavenged. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, I hope this story has reached you in the way I intended it to, slowly and carefully, and with the weight it deserves. Then I want to take a moment before we begin the final stretch of this journey together. The final chapters of this story are about what Nora Fuller's case means. Not just what happened, but what it tells us. What it asks us to understand about the world we live in, and the world that she lived in, and the distance between those two worlds that is sometimes smaller than we would like to believe. We are almost there. Stay with me. There is a particular quality to the grief that surrounds an unsolved murder. A quality that distinguishes it sharply from the grief that follows a case that has been prosecuted and resolved, even imperfectly, even with a verdict that feels inadequate to the weight of what has been done. In resolved cases, grief has somewhere to go. The trial creates a structure, a beginning and a middle and an end, and even when the ending is painful, even when the sentence feels short or the verdict feels wrong, the structure itself provides something to push against, something to argue with, something to carry the grief forward into or beyond. The unresolved case provides none of this. The grief has no structure to inhabit. It simply sits in open space, without walls, without a ceiling, without any of the architecture that allows suffering to eventually settle into something livable. This is what Nora Fuller's family lived with. This is what the investigators lived with. The ones who had worked the case with genuine dedication and had found themselves stopped, not by lack of effort, but by the combination of inadequate investigative tools, a missing suspect, and circumstantial evidence that had not quite been sufficient to close the distance between suspicion and proof. And it is, in a different and smaller way, what anyone who has spent time with this case carries away from it. The open-endedness, the unfinished sentence, the question that hangs in the air without an answer to bring it down. What we can do, from this remove of time, is something the immediate investigators could not quite do. We can see the case whole. We can look at all of its pieces simultaneously and note the patterns and the consistencies and the gaps without the pressure of an active investigation, without the deadline of a disappearing suspect, without the particular distorting lens of 1902 journalism and the assumptions of 1902 society. We can bring to it the knowledge and the vocabulary that the intervening century has given us, the understanding of grooming, the understanding of organized predatory behavior, the understanding of how false identities function in the construction of a predatory scheme, and we can read the evidence in that light and see things that may not have been visible at the time. What do we see? We see a man who targeted a specific category of victim, not randomly, not opportunistically, but with clear intentionality. The advertisement specified a young white girl. This is a selection criterion. It is designed to filter the pool of respondents to produce exactly the kind of person he was looking for: young, female, working class, in need of employment, likely from a family without resources, and without the social connections that might make her disappearance generate immediate, powerful responses from people with the ability to press law enforcement. He knew what he was looking for. He specified it. And the specification was followed by the cultivation of at least one specific girl through phone calls and theater tickets, which suggests that either he had multiple potential targets in view and cultivated whichever ones responded most amenably, or he had already identified Nora specifically and was using the advertisement as a formal pretext for a meeting that had been long in the planning. Either interpretation reflects the same underlying orientation. This was a predator who selected, who screened, who chose. Not someone who acted on sudden impulse with whoever happened to be available, but someone who applied selection criteria and took the time to cultivate the chosen target. This is the hallmark of a certain kind of organized sexual predator, the kind who is not driven primarily by opportunism, but by a specific and sustained compulsion that he manages through planning and preparation rather than leaving to chance. We also see a man who was not new to deception. The ease with which he moved between aliases, Bennett, Hawkins, and presumably others before and after, suggests long practice. The comfort with which he gave a false hotel address to a landlady, with which he signed a lease agreement with a false name and a month's cash rent, with which he placed a newspaper advertisement under yet another alias and managed the response to it through the postal system rather than in person. This is the behavior of someone for whom deception was a familiar and practiced tool, not something attempted awkwardly for the first time. In the language of modern profiling, this profile, organized, methodical, practiced in deception, able to sustain a false presentation over extended periods, selecting victims from a defined vulnerable category, is associated with repeat offending. Not in every case, but with high frequency. The person who commits this kind of crime for the first time is, statistically, far less organized than this. The elaborate apparatus of preparation and cover suggests accumulated experience. Perhaps not an identical crime committed identically before, but something. Some history of behavior in this direction, some sequence of events that preceded January 1902 and shaped the man who prepared the room on Sutter Street. If he had done this before, the historical record does not give us a clear account of it. There are no other cases from the San Francisco of 1901 or 1900 that the historical sources available to us connect directly to the murder of Nora Fuller. But the absence of a clear record is not the same as the absence of prior crimes. In 1902, the documentation of crimes, particularly crimes against poor girls from working-class families, was incomplete, inconsistent, and often inadequate. Cases were managed and closed and filed without the kind of systematic cross-referencing that might have revealed a pattern. The man who had assaulted a 15-year-old girl before becoming Charles B. Hadley, the prior offense that appears in Hadley's history. That assault might have been one of many incidents that collectively created the profile we see in the Nora Fuller case. Or the prior offense might not have been Hadley's at all, if Hadley was not the killer. We do not know. What we know is that the murder of Nora Fuller was not a simple crime. It was not the random violence of an impulsive moment. It was the culmination of a carefully designed and patiently executed predatory scheme, carried out by a person or persons, if the question of accomplices is ever raised, and in cases this planned, that question sometimes does get raised, who understood what they were doing and had taken steps to protect themselves from the consequences of it. And the steps they took, in 1902, were largely sufficient. The consequences did not come. The apartment was found, but the man was not. The aliases were identified, but the real name behind them remained uncertain. The suspect was named, but was never apprehended. And the room on Sutter Street was eventually emptied of its evidence, and its memory, and its horror, and life went on around it in the way that life goes on around the sites of terrible things, absorbing them slowly until they become part of the texture of a city's history rather than the active wound of its present. There is a building at 2211 Sutter Street today, not the same building, because San Francisco has been rebuilt and altered and shaken by earthquakes and reshaped by time in the century since 1902, but an address in the same location, a place in the city where the apartment once stood. The people who live or work there today in all likelihood know nothing about what happened in the winter of 1902. The address has no marker, no memorial, no visible acknowledgement that a 15-year-old girl was brought there and murdered in a room that a man had spent 3 days preparing for the purpose. Cities do not always mark their horror. Sometimes they absorb it silently, and the horror becomes part of the invisible history that runs beneath the surface of the visible city. The history that is there if you know to look for it, that is felt but not seen, that shapes the city in ways no one quite articulates, but that everyone who knows about it carries quietly. Nora Fuller is part of San Francisco's invisible history. She is the girl who left Fulton Street on a January morning with a postal card in her hand and hope in her chest, and who was brought by careful and deliberate cruelty to a room in the dark. She is the case that should have been solved and was not. She is the name that should have been remembered and was nearly forgotten. She is the question that history has never found a way to answer. Who was John Bennett? Who was C.B. Hawkins? Was it Charles B. Hadley? Was it someone else? Where did he go? What became of him? We don't know. We may never know. But we know her name. And we know her story. And we know enough about the kind of person who planned what was done to her to understand it for what it was. Not the random tragedy it might have appeared to be from the outside, but the outcome of a deliberate design, carried out by someone who chose to do it and knew what they were doing and walked away without consequence. If you are lying in bed right now, and you have a daughter, or a niece, or a granddaughter, or any girl in your life who is young and trusting and navigating a world that does not always protect her the way it should, I want you to feel, for just a moment, the weight of what Nora Fuller's mother felt. Not to make you afraid, but to make you present. Present to the reality that Nora was a real person whose loss was total and whose story deserves to be carried by the community of people who take the time to hear it. And then I want you to take a breath and let that weight settle into something quieter. Because Nora Fuller's story, for all its darkness, is also a story about persistence. About the refusal of investigators and journalists, and eventually storytellers like the ones who keep the memory of her case alive, to simply let the darkness have the last word. The last word belongs to her. Eleanor Parline, born in China in 1886. Nora Fuller, who dreamed of the stage and needed work and answered an advertisement and trusted someone she should not have been given reason to distrust. 15 years old. Her story is still being told. And that matters. One of the things that is most striking about the investigation into Nora Fuller's murder, when you read through the historical accounts carefully, is how many people knew pieces of the story that no one had put together until after it was too late. Madge Graham knew about the older man named Bennett, the phone calls, the theater tickets. The grocery store owner knew that calls had come regularly for Nora. The restaurant staff at the popular restaurant knew about Tenderloin, knew his face, his habit, his nickname. The landlady at 2211 Sutter Street had rented an apartment to C.B. Hawkins and noted his behavior, the advance rent payment, the false hotel address. The furniture delivery people had brought the mattress at night and observed the specific instruction about timing. Each of these people held a piece of the picture. None of them, individually, held enough of it to understand what they were looking at while it was happening. This is the architecture of successful predation. The plan is distributed across multiple encounters, across multiple people who each see only a fragment, none of them seeing enough to recognize the whole. The restaurant staff saw a regular customer with a particular food preference. The landlady saw a paying tenant. The furniture delivery saw a customer with an unusual preference for night delivery. Madge Graham saw a friend with a secret older acquaintance. The grocery store owner saw a girl taking phone calls. No one saw all of it, and the man who planned it had arranged things specifically so that no one would. This distributed quality of the plan, its deliberate fragmentation across multiple witnesses who would each see only an innocuous piece, is one of the features that makes it so sophisticated and so chilling. It suggests a mind that could model, in advance, how different components of the scheme would be perceived by different people who had no knowledge of the other components. A mind that could say, the landlady will see only a tenant. The furniture delivery will see only a customer. The restaurant staff will see only a regular. And Nora herself will see only what? A friend? A benefactor? A man who liked her and thought she had potential and was willing to help her find a foothold in the world? Whatever she saw it through the lens of what he had spent weeks or months carefully constructing for her. And the lens was calibrated precisely to produce a specific outcome: her presence, willingly, in the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street on the night of January 11th, 1902. It worked, and then it ended. The investigation that followed was not unsuccessful in the way that many people assume when they look at the case now and note that no one was ever charged. It was actually quite effective in several important respects. It identified both aliases. It connected them through handwriting analysis. It identified Charles B. Hadley as a compelling primary suspect, assembled a substantial circumstantial case, and did all of this in 1902, without computers, without DNA analysis, without any of the forensic and investigative technology that we now take for granted. The investigators who worked this case were working with pencil and paper and shoe leather and the human observation of people who had been present at particular places at particular times. What stopped the investigation was not a failure of intelligence or effort. What stopped it was the suspect's successful flight and the limitations of the communication and transportation systems available to law enforcement in 1902. Circulars could be printed and sent, but they could not cover every corner of a country as large as the United States, and a man who had already demonstrated his comfort with false identities and his willingness to shed one persona for another could, in 1902, reasonably expect to walk into a new city under a new name and not be found. Charles B. Hadley, born Charlie Start, walked out of San Francisco and was never formally located. Whether he was alive or dead when the circulars finally stopped generating new attention, whether he had reinvented himself somewhere, or whether the weight of what he had done had eventually collapsed something inside him, no one knows. No one has ever reported finding a credible sighting that could be confirmed and attached to the historical record in a way that closes the question. He is simply gone, vanished, as completely, in his own way, as Nora's father had vanished into the sea aboard the Taiwan years before. There is something terrible about that symmetry. The two vanishings that bracket Nora's life. Her father at the beginning, her killer at the end. Both men who were present and then were not. Both men who left absence in their wake. Both absences never resolved. Her father's disappearance created the vulnerability that shaped her circumstances. Her killer's disappearance created the absence of justice that has lasted more than a century. Nora Fuller exists, in the historical record, surrounded by men who left without explanation. This is not her fault. This is not her story's fault. It is simply the particular cruelty of how things unfolded, the specific shape that the randomness and the deliberateness of human behavior combined to take in one specific life, in one specific city, in one specific winter. We want to talk, in the final section of this story, about legacy. About what the murder of Nora Fuller left behind. Not just in the grief of her family and the unresolved files of the San Francisco investigators, but in the broader story of how cases like hers have shaped our understanding of predatory behavior, of investigative practice, of the social conditions that create and sustain vulnerability. Because Nora Fuller's case is not just a San Francisco story. It is an American story. It is a story about the intersection of poverty and gender and the particular dangers that intersection creates. It is a story about the gap between what a society tells its most vulnerable members about how to be safe, be careful, be cautious, be suspicious of strangers, and the reality of how the most sophisticated predators actually operate, not through force from strangers, but through the careful, patient cultivation of trust from someone who presents as a friend, a benefactor, a person with resources and interest and apparent goodwill. The job advertisement phenomenon, the use of fraudulent employment offers to lure vulnerable people, did not begin with Nora Fuller's case, and it did not end there. Versions of this scheme appear in the historical record before 1902 and continue in updated forms in the present day. The online job scam, the fraudulent work opportunity, the promise of employment as a mechanism for bringing vulnerable people into dangerous situations. The technology changes. The fundamental dynamic does not. What has changed, in the century since 1902, is our understanding of that dynamic. We have names for grooming now. We have legal frameworks that recognize it. We have organizations dedicated to identifying and responding to it. We have a public awareness, still imperfect and still insufficient, but meaningfully greater than it was in 1902, that the most dangerous people are often the ones who work hardest to appear safe. That trust, cultivated deliberately and presented as genuine, can be a weapon. That a theater ticket and a phone call from an older man to a young girl can be the beginning of something that ends in a room prepared in advance for a specific purpose. This understanding did not come from nowhere. It came, in part, from cases like Nora Fuller's. From the accumulated horror of what happens when a community does not have the framework to recognize what is happening until after it has already happened. From the investigators and journalists and eventually researchers and advocates who looked at cases like this one and said, there is a pattern here, and the pattern can be described, and if it can be described it can be recognized, and if it can be recognized perhaps some portion of the harm it causes can be prevented. Nora Fuller's case did not generate this understanding by itself, but it is part of the accumulation of evidence from which that understanding was built. Her story, like the stories of the other girls and women who were harmed by similar schemes in similar eras, is part of the historical foundation of modern child protection, the raw material, painful and irreplaceable, from which the architecture of safeguarding was eventually constructed. She deserved to be protected by structures that did not yet exist. That is the tragedy. And the legacy, the only positive legacy, is that those structures now exist in at least partial form, and their existence was purchased, in part, by stories like hers. This does not console. There is no consolation here. Not really. Not for a girl who died at 15 in a room she had been brought to through deliberate deception. But it is the truth. And the truth is what we owe her, even when the truth is this hard. Take a breath. We are nearly at the end of this story. Not because the story is fully resolved. It never will be, the way cold cases never fully resolve, but because we have reached the place where we must let it rest. Where we must acknowledge what we know and what we do not know and what we carry away from the knowing and the not knowing, and allow ourselves to close the chapter as gently as possible and return to the quiet. There are final things to say, and then we rest. The legacy of a cold case is a strange and specific kind of thing. It is not the legacy of a resolved story, not the closure of a verdict, not the narrative satisfaction of justice delivered, not the particular kind of peace that comes when a community can look at a case and say, we found out what happened, and the person who did it was held accountable, and the chapter is closed. The legacy of a cold case is more complicated and more uncomfortable than that. It is the legacy of an unfinished sentence, of a question held in suspension, of a wound that has not closed cleanly and therefore has not healed quite right. Nora Fuller's case carries that kind of legacy. It is present in the historical record as a case that was investigated seriously, taken seriously, covered extensively, and then not solved. It is present in the archives of the San Francisco newspapers of 1902 as weeks and months of front-page coverage that gradually diminished as the investigation stalled and the city's attention moved to other things. It is present in the investigative files of the detectives who worked it, files that presumably contain all the pieces of the story that were assembled and the pieces that were tried and could not be connected. It is present, somewhere, in the records that might tell us where Charles B. Hadley went when he left San Francisco, if Hadley was the man. And it is present, in a different way, in the broader conversation about how we understand and respond to predatory violence against women and girls. Because the murder of Nora Fuller was, in 1902, ahead of its time in the specific ways it forced investigators and the public to grapple with questions that would not have formal frameworks for many more decades. The question of grooming. The question of how a false identity can be constructed and maintained across multiple encounters. The question of how a predator selects and prepares his victims. The question of how the investigation of such a crime is complicated by the victim's apparent participation in the chain of events that led to her death. The fact that she went willingly to the restaurant, willingly to wherever she went next, because she had been given no reason, from inside her experience, to perceive the danger she was in. These questions are not unique to Nora Fuller's case. They are questions that appear in cases of predatory violence throughout history and continue to appear today. But in 1902, they appeared without the frameworks that would have helped investigators, journalists, and the public understand what they were looking at. The investigation worked with the tools and concepts available to it, and those tools and concepts were not yet sufficient to fully describe the kind of crime that had been committed against Nora Fuller. This is part of why the case was not solved. Not the primary reason. The primary reason is that Charles B. Hadley, or whoever the killer was, successfully fled and was not found. But a contributing reason is that the full nature of what had been done to Nora was not something that 1902 had a complete language for, and the absence of that language made certain investigative directions harder to see and harder to pursue. The theater tickets and the phone calls, understood today as clear indicators of grooming behavior, were understood in 1902 in a more ambiguous way. They introduced complexity into the victim narrative. They suggested that Nora had a relationship with someone, and the nature of that relationship was uncertain, and uncertainty about the victim's relationship with her killer has historically been used, in ways that are not appropriate and not just, to muddy the waters around the crime and the perpetrator's culpability. This was not necessarily the intent of those who raised the question in 1902, but it was a consequence that any modern observer can recognize and name. Let us be clear one final time, because clarity matters here, and it matters specifically for the audience listening to this story, for the women who are lying in their beds or sitting in their chairs with their phones and their headphones, who know from their own lives something about navigating a world that does not always protect you the way it should. Let us be clear, Nora Fuller was not responsible for what was done to her. Whatever relationship she had with the man called Bennett, whatever phone calls she received and theater tickets she accepted and outings she participated in, none of that changes the nature of what he did. None of that distributes any portion of the responsibility for her death toward her and away from him. A predator who grooms a victim is not less culpable for the crime he commits at the end of the grooming, because the grooming was successful. The success of the grooming is not mitigating. It is aggravating. It is evidence of premeditation. It is the most damning part of the story. Nora was 15. She was poor. She was looking for work. She received phone calls from an older man who called himself Bennett, and she went with him to a restaurant, and she trusted him in the way that someone who has been carefully cultivated to trust will trust. And she paid for that trust with her life, while the man who had built the trust and then betrayed it walked away and was never held to account. This is the full truth of Nora Fuller's story. It is a hard truth. It does not resolve cleanly. It does not have the ending that the story deserves. But it is the truth, and we tell it in full because Nora deserves for the full truth of what happened to her to be spoken, clearly and without mitigation, into the world. The investigators who worked this case, and they worked it seriously, with genuine dedication and considerable skill given the resources and technology available to them, deserved a better outcome than they got. They had assembled a strong circumstantial case against a primary suspect. They had identified both aliases and connected them through handwriting analysis. They had developed a witness pool. They had a detailed and coherent narrative of the crime. And then the suspect vanished, and without him in custody, all of that work could not be converted into the verdict that justice required. This is one of the cruelest aspects of criminal investigation. The work can be done well and still not produce the outcome it deserves. The evidence can be assembled with care and intelligence and still not be sufficient. The investigation can be conducted with integrity and still end without resolution. And the people at the center of it, the victim, her family, the investigators who poured themselves into the case, are left in the space that the absence of resolution creates, a space that offers no comfort and no closure, only the continuing presence of questions that have no answers. San Francisco in 1902 could not give Nora Fuller justice. The technology was not there. The frameworks were not there. The suspect was gone. The era had not yet developed the investigative and legal tools that might have produced a different outcome. But we are here now. And while we cannot give her justice, the legal kind, the kind with a courtroom and a verdict and consequences attached, we can give her something that has its own value. We can give her memory. We can give her story the telling it deserves, with the care and the honesty and the refusal to simplify or sensationalize that real people and real lives deserve. We can say her name and mean it. We can hold what happened to her with the gravity it demands. Eleanor Parline, Nora Fuller, born in China in 1886, lost at 15 in San Francisco on January 11, 1902. Never found alive. Never avenged. Never forgotten. Not entirely. Not by the people who have taken the time to learn her story and carry it forward. That is what we can offer. And we offer it now, in the quiet of whatever hour this is for you, wherever you are in the world that she never got to see. The night is nearly done with this story, but there is still a little more to say about what we take with us when we leave it, about the specific weight that a story like this one leaves behind. Not the grief, though there is grief. Not the outrage, though there is outrage. Something else. Something that has to do with attention and with witness and with the choice, made consciously or unconsciously by everyone who has listened this far, to be present for a story that asks something of you and does not offer an easy reward for the offering. You chose to be here tonight. You chose to listen. And that choice is, in its small way, the continuation of the chain of people who have refused to let Nora Fuller's story disappear into the general silence of unresolved cases. The newspapers that covered it in 1902, the investigators who worked it seriously and with care, the historians and researchers and storytellers who have revisited it across the decades since. And now you are part of that chain. And that matters. Let us finish this together. There is a question that often comes up in discussions of historical cold cases. Cases from a century or more ago. Cases where the victims are long dead and the suspects are long dead and the witnesses are long dead, and the only thing that remains is the record, the newspaper archives, the investigative files, the coroner's reports, the fragments of testimony preserved in the particular amber of 19th and early 20th century journalism. The question is, why? Why do we tell these stories? What is the purpose of spending this kind of time and attention on something that happened more than 100 years ago, that cannot be changed, that cannot be resolved, that cannot generate the kind of actionable outcome, an arrest, a trial, a verdict, that we associate with justice? The question is a reasonable one, and it deserves a genuine answer. We tell these stories because the past is not past in the way that word sometimes implies. It does not exist in a sealed container, separate from the present, without connection to the world we live in now. The past is always present in the patterns it established, in the conditions it created, in the frameworks of understanding or misunderstanding that it handed forward to the people who came after. The murder of Nora Fuller in 1902 is not simply a story about 1902. It is a story about the conditions under which young women and girls become vulnerable to predatory violence, conditions that have changed in some respects and have not changed in others. It is a story about how communities respond to that violence, with sympathy and outrage and the complex mixture of insight and error that real human responses always involve. It is a story about the gap between what a society professes about the value of its most vulnerable members and what it actually provides in terms of the structures and the support that would translate those professions into genuine protection. These are not 1902 questions. These are questions that live in the present with the same urgency that they had then. The specific circumstances have changed. The fundamental dynamics have not changed as much as we might hope. And so we tell these stories not as exercises in nostalgia or as entertainment derived from historical horror, but as a form of learning, as a way of seeing clearly, more clearly, perhaps, than it was possible to see at the time, what happened and why, and what it might tell us about the work that remains to be done in the present. The murder of Nora Fuller is part of the long, painful, slow process by which a society comes to understand something important about the nature of predatory violence and the social conditions that sustain it. We are, all of us who have listened to this story tonight, part of that ongoing process of understanding. And understanding matters. It is the beginning of the kind of change that prevents future harm, even if it cannot undo past harm. This is perhaps the best thing that can be said about what we do here on nights like this one. We cannot undo what happened to Nora Fuller. We cannot reach back across the century and stand between her and the man who led her to the apartment at 2211 Sutter Street. We cannot give her mother a verdict. We cannot give the investigators the closure their work deserved. But we can carry the understanding forward. We can hold the story clearly and honestly. We can bring to it the vocabulary and the frameworks that 1902 did not have and apply them to what the evidence tells us, so that the full shape of what was done becomes visible in a way that it perhaps could not be at the time. And in doing that, we honor the truth. And honoring the truth is the closest thing to justice that time allows. Let us think, for a few minutes, about the three theories one final time, not to choose between them definitively, because the evidence does not permit a definitive choice, but to note what each of them tells us, and what each of them asks us to consider. If Charles B. Hadley was the killer, if the initials and the prior assault and the destroyed clothing and the false mustache and the embezzlement and the disappearance all add up to the most likely answer, then the story of Nora Fuller is, at its heart, the story of a man who had been displaying his dangerous nature to the people around him for years without being stopped. The prior assault, the embezzlement, the comfort with false identities. These were signals. These were the warning signs that, if the systems around Hadley had been capable of recognizing and acting on them, might have interrupted the trajectory that led to a room on Sutter Street. They were not recognized in time. Or if recognized, they were not acted on in a way that prevented what came next. This is a pattern that recurs in cases of predatory violence with disturbing frequency. The person who ultimately commits the most serious harm has often already displayed, to people who were in a position to see it, behavior that should have raised flags. The assault that was noted but not fully prosecuted. The dishonesty that was observed but managed informally. The discomfort that people in his orbit felt but did not name clearly enough or loudly enough or to the right people to produce a response that interrupted the pattern. We have better systems now, in theory, for recognizing and responding to these warning signs. Whether we consistently use them as well as we could is a separate and uncomfortable question. If Charles B. Hadley was not the killer, if the second theory is correct and F.W. Crone's non-identification should be taken at face value, then the story of Nora Fuller is the story of a predator who was never identified, never brought to the edge of accountability, never even named with certainty in the historical record. And this particular story is perhaps the most disturbing, because it is the story of someone who left the least possible trace and was therefore never stopped, and who may have gone on to harm others in ways that were never connected to each other, or to San Francisco, or to a 15-year-old girl found in a dark room in February of 1902. The unidentified predator in a historical cold case is a particularly heavy kind of absence, because unlike the named and suspected predator who evaded justice, this person left no name for anyone to pursue. The investigation had no name to put on the circulars. There was only the description, the silk hat, the brown mustache, the porterhouse tenderloin, the refined manner, and descriptions, without names, are difficult to convert into accountability. And if the third theory is the most accurate, if Nora Fuller knew the man she went to meet, if the relationship had been built over weeks or months before January 11th, if the advertisement and the postal card were the final act of a much longer drama, then the story is about the particular cruelty of a betrayal that began not with violence, but with something that felt, from inside Nora's experience, like kindness, like interest, like the attention of someone who thought she mattered. This is perhaps the cruelest theory of the three, not because it implies worse violence. The physical violence was the same in all three, but because it implies the longest duration of deliberate harm. Because if she had known him, if she had trusted him, If she had experienced from him something that functioned as care and interest and attention over an extended period, then the betrayal of that trust was not a single moment. It was the culmination of a sustained deception, a long performance of false humanity that ended in the most definitive possible withdrawal of that false humanity on the night it was no longer useful to maintain. All three theories point toward the same fundamental truth. A man made choices. Many choices. Over time. With intention. And those choices ended the life of a 15-year-old girl who had not made choices that were equivalent to his, who had simply tried to navigate a world that did not protect her well, and who trusted someone who had invested in making himself worthy of trust for the specific purpose of exploiting that trust when the moment arrived. This is what we know. This is what we carry. The investigation of the murder of Nora Fuller by the San Francisco Police Department in 1902 was as thorough as its era permitted. The investigators identified both aliases, connected them through expert analysis, developed a primary suspect, assembled circumstantial evidence, and maintained public pressure on the case for months through the combination of their own work and the sustained attention of the press. What they could not do, find and apprehend the suspect, was not a failure of effort or intelligence, but of the limitations inherent to law enforcement in the early 20th century. Charles B. Hadley, the primary suspect, was never found. The case was never formally resolved. The killer, whoever he was, died without a verdict attached to his name. And Nora Fuller's family, her mother and whatever siblings and extended family she had, lived with that absence in the way that families of murder victims always live with the absence of justice, carrying it quietly through years and decades, each year the anniversary of January 11th arriving and carrying its particular weight, unassuaged by any outcome that might have helped it settle into something lighter. We tell her story tonight in the hope that the telling is, in its small way, the kind of reckoning that official processes were never able to provide. Not a verdict, not a sentence, but a recognition, an acknowledgement, a declaration, in the quiet of a late night, that Nora Fuller existed and that what was done to her mattered, and that the fact of her story deserves to be held in living memory rather than buried in historical archives. She existed. She mattered. Her story is real, and we carry it forward. Before we come to the final moments of this story together, I want to stay in San Francisco for a few minutes more. Not in the winter of 1902, not in the dark apartment on Sutter Street or the fog-covered streets outside the popular restaurant, but in the longer arc of what Nora Fuller's case meant to the city that had failed to protect her and failed to deliver justice for what was done to her. San Francisco in 1902 was a city that believed in itself. It had survived the roughness of its gold rush origins and emerged as one of the great cities of the American West, ambitious, cosmopolitan, culturally vibrant, connected to the Pacific Rim in ways that set it apart from the cities of the Atlantic coast. It had cable cars and opera houses and restaurants where men of means ate porterhouse steaks beneath gaslit chandeliers. It had the energy of a place that had grown fast and was still growing, still becoming, still assembling itself into the city it wanted to be. And it had, beneath all of that, the things that cities like this always have beneath the surface of their ambition: poverty and desperation, and the invisible populations of people who did not appear in the opera houses or the fine restaurants, but who did the work that kept the city running, who lived in the modest neighborhoods and sent their children to school until the family needed the children to work, and then sent them into the world to find whatever the world was willing to offer. Nora Fuller was one of those children. The city had not seen her, not clearly, not fully, until the moment of her disappearance made her visible. And then it had seen her in the particular way that cities see their dead victims, with sympathy and grief and the desire to make sense of the loss, all of it mixed with the complications of class and gender that shaped how victims were understood and how their stories were told. The sustained newspaper coverage of the Nora Fuller case, months of front pages, weeks of sustained public attention, was both a tribute to how much the city was moved by what had happened and a complicated artifact of the era's journalism, which could be simultaneously humanizing and exploitative, simultaneously outraged on behalf of a victim and curious about her in ways that were not always respectful of her complexity as a full human person. This is the nature of crime journalism in any era. It serves multiple purposes at once, and not all of them are fully aligned with the victim's dignity or the truth of their life. But the city remembered. That much is clear from the historical record. The investigation remained open. The reward pressure continued. The newspapers returned to the case when new developments emerged. This is not the behavior of a community that has decided a girl's death does not matter. This is the behavior of a community that is genuinely troubled by what has happened and genuinely wants accountability, even if the forms that want takes are imperfect. The earthquake of 1906, the great earthquake and fire that would destroy much of San Francisco and reshape it from the ground up, came just 4 years after Nora Fuller's murder. It is not possible to know what happened to the records of her case in that catastrophe, whether files were preserved or lost, whether evidence survived or was consumed in the fires that followed the shaking. The earthquake is a kind of punctuation mark in San Francisco's history, a before and after that divides the city's story in ways that are both physical and archival. What existed before 1906 survived into the present in incomplete form, and what was lost in that devastation cannot be recovered. Nora Fuller's case is part of what existed before 1906. Its records, whatever survived and whatever did not, are part of the incomplete archive of a city that was rebuilt from the rubble of an earlier version of itself. This physical history, the earthquake, the fire, the rebuilding, adds another layer of inaccessibility to a case that was already cold, another reason why the trail, never warm to begin with, has become progressively harder to follow across the decades. What we have is what we have. The newspaper accounts, the investigative details reported publicly, the testimony of witnesses preserved in print, the coroner's findings, the handwriting experts' conclusions, the physical details of the apartment and the evidence found there. These fragments, assembled carefully, constitute the story we have been telling tonight. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. As real as anything that survives from a century ago is real. Present in the record, available to the attention of people willing to look for it, waiting to be told to people willing to listen. There is one more thing I want to say about Charles B. Hadley before we leave him to history, or to wherever history has put him. There is a version of this story in which Hadley was innocent, in which the alignment of his initials and his prior offense and his destroyed clothing and his disappearance were exactly what a defense attorney would call them: circumstantial, coincidental, insufficient. In which F.W. Crone's non-identification was accurate and dispositive. In which the real killer was someone the investigation never found, and Hadley was a guilty-seeming man who happened to be in the vicinity of the investigation without being connected to the crime. This version is uncomfortable in a different way than the version where Hadley was guilty. Because if Hadley was innocent, then two injustices occurred in the case of Nora Fuller. The first was her murder, committed by someone who was never identified. The second was the destruction of Hadley's reputation and the implied accusation that attached itself to his name through public newspaper coverage in a city hungry for a guilty party. His life, wherever it went after he left San Francisco, would have been shaped by that accusation whether or not he was guilty of the thing it accused him of. This is the additional harm that unsolved cases generate. The suspects who were never charged, never tried, never given the opportunity to be acquitted. People whose names and faces appeared in newspapers in connection with a crime that was never resolved, who carry that association forward without any legal mechanism to clear it. Whether Hadley was guilty or innocent, this harm was real. We cannot resolve it now. We can only acknowledge it and add it to the accumulated cost of a case that was never brought to the resolution justice required. The final weeks of the investigation, before the case effectively went cold, were characterized by the particular frustration of an investigation that has assembled everything except the one thing it needs most: the suspect, present and accountable, in a room where the evidence can be put before him and the question of his guilt or innocence can finally be addressed. The investigators had the evidence. They did not have the man. And without the man, the evidence was an answer looking for the question it was supposed to answer, a verdict without a trial, a reckoning without anyone to be reckoned with. The investigators did not give up easily. The circulars continued for months. The tips came in and were followed. The Kansas City lead was investigated and eliminated. The reward pressure was maintained. The newspapers kept publishing. The case was kept technically open. All of this reflects the genuine effort of people who believed they knew what had happened and who wanted, with real urgency, to see that belief translated into accountability. It was not enough. The suspect was gone. The case would remain what it became, a monument to the limits of what justice can achieve when the person it needs to account to it has successfully placed themselves beyond its reach. And so here we are. The lights have been low for a long time now. Your breath has hopefully settled into something slower and steadier than it was when we began. The story has been long and difficult, and without the resolution that difficult stories ideally have, and yet, I hope, not without value, not without meaning, not without the kind of weight that leaves you, as you drift towards sleep, with a sense of having been genuinely present for something real. Because that is what Nora Fuller deserves. Not to be a sensation, not to be entertainment, but to be genuinely present for, in the way that real people in real pain deserve to be present for, even across the vast distance of time. Eleanor Parline. Nora Fuller. 15 years old. San Francisco, 1902. She was real. She mattered. She deserved better from the world that she had the misfortune of being born into. A better father who did not vanish. A better world that provided more safety for girls like her. A better outcome on a January afternoon when she left her house with a postal card in her hand and hope in her chest, and walked into the carefully constructed darkness that a predator had prepared for her. She deserved all of that. And the fact that she did not receive any of it is not a fact that resolves easily or rests comfortably. It sits with a particular heaviness, the particular heaviness of genuine and irreversible loss. We carry it forward from here. Take your time. Breathe. Let yourself be still for a moment before we come to the very end. We have almost arrived. And so we have come to the last place this story has to take us. Not to a resolution, because the resolution was never given, but to the place where the story ends and the silence begins. The place where everything that has been said, and what remains is the weight of it, quiet now, settling. Let me say a few final things about Nora Fuller before I let you rest. She was born into circumstances that required her to be strong, without having been given much in the way of the support that strength is built upon. Her father was gone before she was old enough to remember him properly. Her mother did what she could with what she had. The family moved, survived, endured. Nora quit school at 15 and went looking for work, which was not a failure of character or judgment, but a response to necessity. The kind of response that millions of girls in millions of families across the history of this country have made, stepping into the world before the world was ready to receive them safely, doing what they had to do because the alternatives were worse. She received a postal card. She went to a restaurant. She made a phone call home that someone was waiting to receive. And then she went somewhere that she believed was safe, or safer than it turned out to be, and she did not come home. A month later, she was found. And everything that could be done to find out who had done this, with the tools available in 1902, was done. And it was not enough. This is the truth of her story. And it is also the truth of too many stories. The stories of girls and women who navigated a world that did not protect them adequately and paid the highest possible price for the gap between the protection that was available and the protection that was needed. Stories that ended without the resolution that justice promises, but does not always deliver. Stories that became cold cases, and then historical cases, and then cases that are told on nights like this one, in the quiet, to people willing to listen. You have listened tonight, for a long time, with patience and attention and the kind of presence that Nora Fuller's story has always deserved and has not always received. And I want you to know that the act of listening matters. The act of choosing to hear a difficult story completely, without looking away, without needing it to be simpler or cleaner or less painful than it is. This is a form of witness. And witness matters. It is what keeps the dead present in the world of the living. It is what keeps cold cases from becoming forgotten cases. It is what turns historical events into living memory. You are part of Nora Fuller's living memory tonight. And that is not nothing. That is, in its particular and quiet way, something significant. If you have made it this far, if you have stayed with this story through all of its darkness and all of its uncertainty, through the theories and the evidence and the frustrating absence of resolution, then I hope you will also carry it forward in the way that the best listeners do, not just by having heard it, but by holding it, by letting it be part of what you understand about the world, about the conditions under which harm happens and the conditions under which it might be prevented, about the gap between the world we want and the world we have, and the ongoing work of closing that gap. And if this is the first time you have been here, on this channel, with this community, welcome. This is what we do here. We tell the stories of real people. We hold them carefully. We do not rush. We do not sensationalize. We sit with the weight of what is true, even when what is true is heavy, because real people deserve real witness. If you have been here before, then you know already what this space is. You know why you come back. And I am grateful for your presence every time. Before you close your eyes and let this long night finally carry you into sleep, I want to ask you to do one small thing. If Nora Fuller's story has moved you tonight, if you have felt something while listening to it, whether sadness or anger or the particular kind of grief that belongs to stories that do not resolve, leave a comment below this video. Tell me where you are. Tell me what you are feeling. Tell me what you are taking away from a story that has been waiting over a century to be told to someone willing to hear it. Because this community is built on exactly that. On the willingness of people to be present for difficult stories, to carry them forward, to say the names of people who might otherwise be forgotten. Your comment is part of that. Your presence is part of that. And if you are not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. It means that the next time this channel sits down to tell a story like this one, you will be there to hear it. It means that the next name, the next cold case, the next girl or woman or man whose story deserves to be told with care and honesty and the refusal to look away, it means that they will have you in the audience. And that matters more than you might think. Like the video if you can. It tells the platform that this kind of storytelling matters. That stories like Nora Fuller's deserve space in the world alongside all the other stories competing for attention. That slow, careful, honest witness to real human tragedy has an audience. And that audience shows up and stays and listens all the way to the end. You showed up tonight. You stayed. You listened all the way to the end. Thank you. Now, before we move on, let me say her name one final time. Not dramatically, not as a flourish, just quietly, in the way that someone says the name of a person they want to make sure the world does not forget. Nora Fuller. Eleanor Parline. Born 1886. Died January 11th, 1902. In San Francisco, California. 15 years old. The case was investigated seriously, the suspect was named, but never found, and the case was never formally resolved. She was real. She mattered. She is remembered tonight by everyone who has listened to this story, and that company of people. You. Wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you, whatever brought you to this video tonight, that company is her legacy. The living memory of people willing to say, I heard your story. I am not going to look away from what happened to you. I am going to carry you forward into whatever comes next. The night is very quiet now. The story has been told. What remains is the closing of the chapter and the beginning of rest, and the particular kind of peace that comes, not from having resolved something, but from having been fully present for something that deserved full presence. Let your body be heavy now. Let the blanket be warm. Let the darkness be comfortable rather than threatening. The way darkness can be when you are safe inside it. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm that carries you away from the waking world and into sleep, where the mind processes what the day has given it and releases what it does not need and keeps what it will carry forward. You have been good company tonight. You have done something valuable by listening. And now you can rest, knowing that Nora Fuller's story has been told tonight with the honesty and the care that it deserves, that her name has been spoken into the world by someone who meant it, and that she is, in the small and persistent way that memory works, a little less forgotten than she was before we started. Rest well, and as you sleep, we will move gently into our next story. Another name, another life, another true account of something that happened to a real person in a real place, told slowly, told carefully, told with the respect that every human story demands and deserves. We will be here when you wake. Or perhaps you will drift through the next story without waking at all, which is exactly as it should be, exactly what this space is for. Good night. Sleep gently. And wherever you are in the world tonight, thank you for being here.